Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from, also what time is it. No one remembered the door being there. Not the builder who laid the bricks. Not the family who lived inside the old stone house for over 3 generations. And certainly not the boy who found it by accident, half hidden behind torn wallpaper and a bookcase filled with dusty volumes no one had touched in years. The door had no handle, no hinges, just a narrow frame, painted the same color as the wall, with a thin slit along the edge, almost like it was waiting to be noticed. What was beyond it? The question wouldn't let go of James. It had been a month since he'd moved into the Thornfield house with his uncle after the accident. His parents' car, wrapped around a sycamore tree on Route 9, dead on impact. At 17, James hadn't known grief could sit so heavy in your lungs, like breathing under wet cement. His uncle Wallace was a historian, the kind who collected artifacts, wrote long-winded letters to academic journals, and lived in houses where the wind moaned through the floorboards like something trapped was trying to whisper its way out. Thornfield House wasn't just old, it was wrong. Even in daylight, it wore a kind of sickness in its bones. The staircase groaned under the lightest step. Paint peeled in patterns that looked too much like words. And the cellar door in the kitchen never stayed shut, no matter how many locks Wallace bolted onto it. But Wallace didn't seem to care. He called it character. He called the cold drafts quirks. He said, "You'll get used to it, James." James didn't get used to it. He didn't get used to the tapping sounds behind the walls at 3:07 a.m., like fingers drumming on hollow wood, or the way his own reflection sometimes seemed delayed as though it forgot to mimic him. And he certainly didn't get used to the feeling that something was always watching him. Something waiting. It started on a rainy Tuesday. Thunder growled low in the sky. James was exploring the attic, partly to get away from Wallace's constant muttering about temporal rifts and cursed objects, and partly because he kept hearing the sound of a child crying up there at night. He told himself it was the wind. The attic was filled with things that didn't make sense. Framed photographs of people with blurred faces, clocks that ticked backward, and a wooden rocking horse that rocked on its own when no one touched it. He found the door behind a bookcase, pushed up against the back wall. The bookcase itself was strange, full of leather, bound journals written in a language that flickered between alphabets depending on how you looked at them. Something pulled at him, not physically, but in a way that made his skin tighten and his ears buzz. He tugged the bookcase away, sending a cloud of dust into the air. And there it was, the door, a door that had no business being there. He stared at it for a long time, something deep in his gut telling him to walk away, to never look back. He didn't listen. James pressed his hand against the smooth wood. It was warm. The rest of the attic was freezing, but the door radiated heat like it was alive. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging the surface. Then he heard it. A knock from the other side. James jerked his hand back. His heart thudded against his ribs like a warning bell. No one else was in the house. Wallace had left early that morning for a museum conference in Salem and wouldn't be back until the next day. Another knock. Slower this time. Measured. James stumbled backward, almost falling over the uneven floorboards. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring. It wasn't until the third knock, a hard, desperate slam, that he ran. He didn't stop until he was on the ground floor, breath ragged, sweat chilling on his neck. That night, the house didn't sleep. The wind screamed outside, shaking the windows in their frames. The lights flickered and buzzed like they were protesting something. James curled under the covers, clutching a flashlight and the one photo he had of his parents, trying to remember their voices. Around midnight, the crying started again, soft, muffled like a child buried beneath floorboards. But this time, it was coming from the attic. James didn't sleep. The next morning, Wallace returned, smelling of wet books and old paper. James cornered him in the kitchen, demanding answers. "There's a door in the attic," he said. "Behind the bookcase." It knocked, Wallace. Wallace's face drained of color. He dropped the bag of groceries he was holding. Eggs cracked on the floor like something brittle breaking open. "You didn't touch it, did you?" Wallace whispered. James hesitated. "I did. Just my hand." Wallace closed his eyes. God help us. That was the first time James saw real fear on his uncle's face. Wallace didn't explain much that day, only that the house was built in 1789 by a man named Silas Crane, a spiritualist and alleged medium who claimed he could speak to the other side. He built Thornfield House with secret rooms and passageways, designed it using rituals from books that were later banned or lost. Silas vanished in 1803. His body was never found. "What does that have to do with the door?" James asked. Wallace only said that door should never be opened. But James was already obsessed. Every night, he returned to the attic. He didn't go near the door, but he listened. Some nights it knocked, some nights it whispered, and some nights it scratched. Things got worse. James began seeing shadows move in places where no light should have cast them. His reflection in mirrors started to move a fraction of a second late. He found things out of place, his toothbrush in the freezer, a crow's feather on his pillow. A message scrawled in fog on the bathroom mirror, "Hail PME." Wallace tried to seal the attic, nailed boards across the entrance. Salt lines, prayer circles. It didn't work. The door was angry now. One night, they heard it roar. Yes, roar, like something huge and hollow had awoken inside. Then came the night the door opened itself. James woke to the smell of sulfur. The house was cold, unnaturally cold. He crept up the stairs, drawn by a sound he couldn't quite place. A humming, low and wet and wrong. The attic door was open. Every nail, every board torn clean out. He climbed the steps, flashlight trembling in his grip. The attic was darker than it had any right to be. His light barely pierced it. And there, the door, it stood open. Only an inch, but enough. Enough to see something shift inside, something vast, something that looked back. He should have run, but something stepped through. James fell backward, dropping the flashlight. In the flickering beam, he saw it, a tall figure, skin the color of bruised meat, mouth stitched shut with wire, its eyes two pits of boiling ink. It moved like a marionette held by too many strings. It didn't walk. It dragged itself forward, and then it spoke, not aloud. Inside James's head, "You heard me," James screamed, scrambling down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind him. But it was too late. The thing was in the house now. Wallace didn't sleep that night. Neither did James. They burned sage. Read passages from books that smelled like old rot and regret. But the thing was still there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, James would wake in the middle of the night to find it standing at the foot of his bed. Not moving, not breathing, just watching. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. 3 days passed. James thought it was over, that whatever he'd let in had gone back. He started to sleep again, eat again. Wallace looked less pale. Until they found the room. It was in the basement, a room that shouldn't have existed. Stone walls slick with something dark. Symbols etched into the floor in a language James didn't recognize. And in the center of the room, an object, a mirror. But not just any mirror. The frame was made of bone, human bone, and the surface was black glass, deeper than pitch. It didn't reflect your face. It showed other things. Faces screaming, eyes bleeding. A forest of hanging bodies. James looked too long. He saw his mother. Not as she had been, but broken, twisted. Her mouth open in a scream that never ended. And then she turned, looked at him. That night, Wallace packed bags. "We have to leave," he said. Now. But James didn't want to leave. Not yet. Because now he was hearing voices, calling him, from the door. And they were saying one thing: "You belong to us now." James didn't remember falling asleep, but when he opened his eyes, he was back in the attic. Not in bed. Not wrapped in blankets, safe beneath the weight of thick covers. No, he was standing, barefoot, just inches from the door that had no right to exist. His hand was stretched out, trembling inches from the handle, less frame. But this time, it was wide open. The darkness beyond wasn't just black, it was hungry. It pulsed, it breathed. And somewhere inside that impossible dark, he could hear it breathing back at him. He wanted to scream, but the sound got stuck behind his teeth, like someone else was already using his throat. Something cold slid around his ankle, a hand, a vine, fingers. He couldn't see it. The dark bent around light, swallowed it whole, but it was pulling, just gently, enough to let him know it could do more if it wanted to. Then he heard her voice again. Jamie, his mother's voice, soft, broken, just like she used to sound on those nights when she couldn't sleep after arguing with his father. He turned toward the sound, and in that motion, the attic shifted. It was no longer the attic. The walls melted like candle wax. The floor curved like something under a magnifying glass, and in the place of the door was a mirror, that mirror, bone framed, black glassed, sitting in the middle of the room like it had always been waiting for him. James didn't remember walking to it. One blink, and he was already there, kneeling. He didn't want to look. Every inch of his body screamed not to. But the mirror pulled at him, not with force, but familiarity. And there she was, his mother. But she wasn't standing. She wasn't even whole. She was crawling, dragging herself through what looked like a field of glass shards, bleeding from her hands. Her face torn where a windshield might have shattered. Her eyes found his, and she whispered, "Don't open the second door." Then her head twisted, sharply, unnaturally, and a shadow grabbed her from behind, yanking her into the dark like a puppet ripped off its strings. James screamed himself awake. He was on the floor of his bedroom, soaked in sweat, the photo of his parents torn in half beside him. He couldn't remember how he got there, or how long he'd been sleeping. Outside, it was still dark, but the mirror, the one from the basement, was gone. He didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But this wasn't ghosts. Ghosts were echoes. Harmless. This thing wanted him, and it had touched something inside him, something deep. Something that felt less like fear and more like familiarity. Wallace found him hours later, curled up under the sink in the kitchen, his eyes red and wild. "You looked into it, didn't you?" Wallace asked, voice trembling. James nodded. Wallace didn't yell. He didn't even seem surprised. He just sat down on the floor across from James, like he was too tired to pretend anymore. "I should have never brought you here," he said quietly. "I thought I could keep it locked away. Thought it would die without attention. But you opened the first door. And that mirror," he shook his head, "that mirror remembers you now." James tried to ask what that meant, but Wallace only stood, went to his study, and came back carrying an old wooden box with runes carved deep into the sides. He opened it slowly, like it might bite him, and took out a key. Not an ordinary key. This one was carved from something black and porous. Bone, maybe. Maybe not. "This isn't for any door in this house," Wallace whispered, "but it's the only thing that might stop what's coming." James stared. "Stop what?" Wallace looked at him, and for the first time, James saw a man who had spent his whole life afraid, and had just lost the last thing he was trying to protect. "There's more than one door, James," he said. "The one in the attic, that was just the first. A lure. Something to get your attention. To test you." James didn't understand. "Test me for what?" Wallace's voice dropped to a near whisper. "To see if you could be used." James didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. He sat in the hallway, staring at the attic door. Wallace had chained it shut again, added salt, burned herbs James couldn't name. But the knocking had returned. It wasn't desperate anymore. It was patient, measured. That night, James began hearing whispers not in the walls, but inside himself. Thoughts that weren't his. Questions whispered in a voice that sounded like his own, but wrong, like someone impersonating him after only reading his diary. You want to know what's behind the second door, don't you? He tried to shut it out. Headphones. Loud music. Talking to Wallace. But the thoughts slithered in during the quiet moments. And always the same message: you'll open it. Because you already did. The next morning, the basement mirror returned. Wallace found it first. Sitting at the foot of his bed, no blood this time, no screaming faces. Just a reflection of Wallace, except the reflection had no eyes. Just deep, endless pits where eyes should have been. Wallace took a hammer and tried to smash it. The glass didn't even scratch. James stayed up the next night with Wallace. They took turns watching the attic, waiting for something. At 3:07 a.m., the door opened by itself again. No noise, no wind, just a slow, smooth creak. And then the smell, like rotting meat left too long in the sun. From inside came a low hum. Not music, not speaking. Just sound that rattled the back of your teeth. And then James saw it. Standing just beyond the door was a figure, not the stitched, mouthed thing from before. This was different. Human-shaped, cloaked in long black robes, face obscured, but it held something in its hand. A mirror, small, oval. The glass was perfectly clear. Inside it, James saw something terrible. Not monsters, not ghosts. Himself, older, hollow-eyed, lips stitched shut. Standing in a burning world where the sky screamed and buildings wept blood. He was holding the same mirror, and he was smiling. James fell to the floor, gasping, clutching his head. Wallace pulled him back, slamming the attic door and yelling words James didn't recognize. Ancient things that sounded like knives scraping over stone. The humming stopped. But the damage was done. James couldn't stop shaking. His fingers wouldn't move right. And worst of all, when he blinked, he still saw that other version of himself. Waiting. You're the one they want, Wallace said, shaking. They need a conduit. A vessel. For what? James asked. Wallace looked at him, tears in his eyes. For the third door, James laughed. A hollow, broken sound. There's a third, Wallace only nodded. And if you open that one, this house won't be the only thing swallowed. James didn't know what to say. His life had stopped being real weeks ago. But one thing was clear. The doors weren't just openings. They were invitations. And someone had already RSVP'd using his name. The next morning, the air in Thornfield House felt different. Not colder, quieter. Too quiet, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. James didn't want to move. Not even to stretch. He just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster like they meant something. And maybe they did. Maybe they were a message, one he didn't understand yet. Maybe the house was trying to speak in the only language it had left. Downstairs, Wallace had stopped pretending everything was fine. There was no more talk of temporal anomalies or spiritual echoes. He had stopped calling the thing in the attic an entity. Now, he just called it him. And that somehow made it worse. James barely ate. He couldn't focus long enough to chew without the taste turning to ash. Every mirror in the house had been either covered or removed. Even the reflective surfaces, pots, doorknobs, silver picture frames had been scratched or smeared. Wallace didn't want reflections. They use them, he said. They see through them. That was the day James discovered the room. Not just any room. A room that wasn't supposed to exist. He hadn't been looking for it. He was pacing, restless, walking through hallways he'd memorized out of boredom. But this hallway didn't feel right. The wallpaper pattern had changed. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Where there used to be flowers, now there were thorns. Where the hallway should have ended with a dead end and a cracked window, now it opened up into a small corridor that sloped downward. That was wrong. Thornfield didn't have basements below the basement. Still, James kept walking. He told himself he was just curious, but that was a lie. Something was guiding him. not pushing, just leading, like a memory he didn't remember choosing, like sleepwalking through someone else's dream. The corridor ended in a wooden door. This one had a handle, rusted, iron, shaped like a serpent swallowing its tail. James touched it, and his skin went cold instantly. Not from the metal, but from the feel. The handle pulsed, almost like it had a heartbeat. He pulled his hand away, but the door creaked open on its own. Inside was a small room, empty. Or so it seemed. There were no windows, but somehow the room was dimly lit, like light was leaking in from cracks that weren't there. The walls were covered in carvings, deep grooves shaped like concentric spirals, overlapping symbols, some of them similar to the ones etched around the mirror Wallace had shown him. But in the center of the room was what drew James in, a single wooden chair. And on it was a book. James stepped inside. The second his foot crossed the threshold, the air changed again. The temperature dropped. The sound of the house faded. He could no longer hear the groans of the old beams, or the wind outside, or even his own heartbeat. He was alone. No, he wasn't. He knew it. Could feel it. Something in the corner, just out of sight, not moving, not breathing, just watching, always watching. He took another step. The door slammed shut behind him. James spun around, heart hammering, hand reaching out to pull it open. But there was no handle on the inside, just smooth wood. Solid, seamless. Great, he muttered, turning back toward the chair. The book sat quietly. Its cover was leather, dark, cracked, ancient. A symbol was burned into the front, a circle with an eye in the center, crossed by 3 jagged lines. James had seen it before. In his dreams. In the mirror. Even on his own skin. Once, briefly, a rash on his wrist that had vanished before he could show Wallace. He opened the book. The pages weren't blank. But they weren't quite full either. Words flickered across them like firelight on water. They moved when he tried to focus. But then, he turned to a page that stayed still. It had his name, not just James. Full name, James Elias Rook. And below it, a sentence: "The vessel is nearly ready." James slammed the book shut. The light in the room went out. He couldn't scream. The sound stuck in his throat. The air grew thick, heavy, and then something whispered behind him. "Do you want to know what you really are?" James ran. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He didn't wait. He threw himself at the door, pounding, screaming, kicking. The walls began to hum. The carvings blood. Thick black liquid poured from the spirals and pooled on the floor, creeping toward his feet. Then, without warning, the door opened. He fell through it, into Wallace's arms. "Where the hell have you been?" Wallace barked. James tried to speak, but only sobs came out. He looked back, and the hallway was gone. Just a blank wall, wallpaper covered in faded floral patterns. No door, no corridor, nothing. Wallace didn't say a word. He just dragged James to the study, poured him a drink, and locked the doors. "You found the memory room," Wallace finally said. James nodded. "You weren't supposed to find it. Not yet." "What's happening to me?" James asked, voice cracking. Wallace looked tired, older than James had ever seen him. "They're opening you," he said, "like a box, like a lock. Whatever your parents were hiding, whatever they were running from, it ends with you." James blinked. "What do you mean, my parents?" Wallace hesitated, then said the one thing that made everything crack wide open. "Your mother was the last one to see what's behind the third door." Silence. James felt like the world had turned upside down. "You told me she didn't believe in any of this." Wallace looked at him. "She believed enough to run." James stood, shaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because if I did, you'd start looking," Wallace said. "And once you start, you don't stop." James didn't sleep that night, not because he was afraid, because now he had to know. There was a second door, and a third, and maybe more. He wasn't sure what waited behind them, but something in his blood, something old and dark and awake, was whispering now, "Come and find us." James didn't ask Wallace for permission. He didn't tell him anything. He waited until the old man was asleep in the study, surrounded by half-drunk glasses of scotch and books too old to be found in libraries anymore, their pages swollen with moisture and age. James waited, and when the house was finally silent, truly silent, not just quiet, he slipped out of his room. Something had changed in him. He wasn't just afraid anymore. He was curious, but not in a normal way. The curiosity pulsed behind his ribs like a second heartbeat. It was warm, familiar, and wrong. It was as if a part of him wanted to know. Needed it. The hallway was darker than usual, as if the shadows were thicker. Or maybe it was the light that was thinner. James moved quietly, but the floor didn't creak. The old house, usually so eager to protest each step, didn't make a sound. That was the first sign. The second came when he reached the attic stairs and found them gone. Not blocked, not sealed. Gone. The staircase had simply vanished, replaced by a smooth wall with no seam. James reached out and touched it. His fingers met wood, solid and firm. But he remembered walking up those steps hundreds of times. He knew what was supposed to be there. The attic was real. The door was real. He'd seen it, felt it, heard it breathe. But the house had moved things again. James took a shaky breath and turned. That's when he saw the other door. Not upstairs. Below, the basement door was open, just slightly. Just enough to make sure he noticed it. A thin line of darkness oozed through the gap like ink spilled in water. James should have walked away. Should have turned back. But that second heartbeat in his chest told him to go forward. He descended the stairs slowly, his bare feet silent on the wood. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell, earthy, wet, and rotting, wrapped around him like a damp blanket. When he reached the bottom, the basement was pitch black. His flashlight flickered just once, then held steady. The mirror was still there. Still bone frame. Still glass like the deepest part of a frozen lake. But tonight, it reflected something new. Him. Standing exactly where he was, same clothes, same expression, except in the reflection, he was smiling. And then the reflection stepped forward. James gasped, stumbled back, but the mirror didn't break, didn't shatter, it just rippled, like a liquid. The reflection raised a hand and pressed it to the other side of the glass. James did the same. The second his fingers touched the surface, it melted, just enough for his hand to slip through, and on the other side, the reflection whispered one word closer. James yanked his hand back. It was wet, slick with something dark. He wiped it on his shirt, and it smeared like oil, like blood that had dried and forgotten how to be read. Then he noticed the trapdoor. It had never been there before. At the far end of the basement, behind a pile of broken furniture and mold, covered trunks, was a wooden panel in the floor, held shut by a rusted latch and sealed with a faded red wax stamp. He knew it was a door. He knew it wasn't supposed to be opened, and he knew he was going to open it anyway. James cleared the junk away. The latch groaned under his hand, but came loose. The wax seal cracked, releasing a breath of air that had been locked away for who knows how long. Air that smelled of stone, iron, and something far worse. Something alive. He lifted the panel. Beneath was a ladder that descended into pitch black nothing. James hesitated, then began to climb. The descent felt endless. He counted rungs. 47. Then 80. Then lost count entirely. The air grew colder, wet. The smell intensified. A mixture of sulfur, mildew, and copper, like blood soaked in old coins. When he reached the bottom, he stood in a circular room carved into raw stone. There were no lights. And yet, he could see. Carvings covered every inch of the stone walls. Spirals, eyes, doors, names, his name. Thousands of times, etched over and over in different sizes, different scripts, all chanting the same message: J. Amos Roke, I teach Kitty-Why. In the center of the room was another door, smaller, older, not made of wood or stone, but something bone-colored, polished, smooth. It pulsed with a slow thrum that James could feel in his teeth. No handle. Just a symbol carved into its face, the eye again. Always the eye, and around it, more writing. This time in English. Do not open until the vessel is full. James stared at it, entranced. His hand reached out on its own, and then a voice whispered in his ear, not from the room, but from inside his skull. Almost. James froze. Behind him, a figure emerged from the shadows. Not the stitched mouth one. Not the robed figure. This one wore his face. But wrong. The eyes were pitch black, too wide. The mouth never stopped smiling, and the thing's skin was gray. Not decayed, just wrong, like it had been stretched too thin. You've come so far, it said in James's voice. But you're not ready. James tried to speak, but nothing came out. You opened the first, the thing said. Touched the second. But the third is hungry. James backed away. The creature stepped forward. Do you want to see what waits behind it? No, James whispered. Yes, you do, it said, grinning wider. You were made to. Then it lunged. James turned and ran, blindly. The ladder was gone. There was no way back. The room twisted. Doors appeared and vanished. The symbols glowed. He could hear whispers rising in pitch, turning into screams. Hands clawed at him from the walls, pulling at his clothes, his hair, his soul. Just when he thought he was going to be swallowed whole, a hand yanked him backward. Wallace. He stood above the trapdoor, face pale, eyes wide. James was back in the basement. The mirror was shattered. Wallace had a crowbar in one hand and a bleeding palm in the other. You went too far, Wallace said. They almost had you. James could barely speak. What's behind it? Wallace didn't answer. Instead, he whispered, I think your mother opened it. And I think she never came back. James sat on the floor, shaking. He knew now. The doors weren't just passages. They were keys. And he was the lock. James didn't leave his room the next morning. He couldn't. His legs felt too heavy. Like the weight of that thing's stare still hung from his body like wet chains. He lay there, eyes wide open, watching the light crawl across the ceiling like a slow, burned fuse. Wallace hadn't spoken a word since pulling him out of the room beneath the basement. The old man had just stood there, panting, eyes full of something James hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger, grief. Deep, buried grief that looked like it had just been freshly dug up. James replayed it over and over in his head, the smile that didn't blink, the voice that wasn't quite his, and the words carved in stone. James Rook is the key. He wanted to believe it was just hallucination, a trick of a tired mind, but deep inside, he knew better. That door wasn't metaphor. It wasn't dream. It was real. And something on the other side had recognized him. He hadn't slept in 2 days, but he wasn't tired. The house made sure of that. When he tried to rest, the knocking would return. It had changed now, not always at the attic door. Sometimes it came from the floorboards beneath his bed, sometimes from inside the walls, and once from the closet, even though he had bolted it shut and wedged a chair beneath the handle. But worst of all were the whispers. They didn't start until the third night. At first, it was soft, unclear, like the hum of radio static right on the edge of tuning in. But it got clearer as the hours crawled on, until the voice broke through like sunlight through clouds. And it was her voice, his mother. James, she whispered, please. It didn't sound right. Not entirely. It was her tone, her lilt. The way she used to say his name when she was worried. But there was something hollow beneath it, something mechanical. Like her voice had been copied from memory and played through something else. Don't let him open it, she whispered again. James sat up, heart pounding. The room was empty, the air still. But the voice had come from the corner. That corner. The one that always felt a little colder, even when the heat was on. The one that didn't quite match the angle of the rest of the room. He didn't speak back. He couldn't. Because if he did, he knew. He knew it would answer again. And he wasn't sure if he could handle what it said. Instead, he went to find Wallace. The old man was in the library, hunched over a book bound in cracked red leather. He didn't look up when James entered. "You heard her, didn't you?" Wallace asked, not even turning a page. James nodded. "How did you know?" "Because she spoke to me too. Years ago, after she first opened the second door." James's stomach dropped. "I thought you said she only opened the third." Wallace finally looked up. "No. She got to the third. She didn't open it. Not fully. But it changed her. Broke something in her. She started hearing things. Seeing things. Your father tried to help. He thought it was trauma. Medication. Therapy. But the more they tried to suppress it, the louder it got." James swallowed hard. "Is that why they left Thornfield?" Wallace nodded. "They fled. Tried to outrun it. But this house doesn't forget. It remembers everyone who touches the threshold of those doors. It waited. And when they were gone, when you were born, it waited for you to come back." James sat down, suddenly dizzy. "So what am I, exactly?" "Some kind of cursed bloodline experiment. A chosen one for a bunch of ancient door demons." Wallace didn't smile. "You're not chosen, James. You're built." The words hit him like ice water. "Built? You think your parents met by accident?" Wallace asked. "Your mother was one of the few people to resist the pull of the third door. Your father came from a long line of protectors, keepers, people who tracked these thresholds and tried to seal them permanently. Together, they thought they could end it. Instead, they made you." James stared. "Are you saying I was made to open the third door?" Wallace looked away. "Or close it. We don't know which. That's the danger." Silence filled the room, heavy and breathing. James wanted to scream. He wanted to laugh, to punch something, to cry. But none of those feelings could find a way out, so he stood. "I need to know what's behind it," he said. Wallace's head snapped up. "James, I need to," he snapped. "Not because it's calling. Not because I'm built. Because if I don't understand what this thing wants, how it thinks, then I'm just waiting to be used. I won't be a pawn in a game I don't even understand the rules to." Wallace sighed. "If you go back down there again, you might not come back." James nodded. "Then come with me." Later that night, armed with old lanterns and salt lines, they descended together. The trapdoor was still open. The ladder had returned. But this time, the descent felt faster, like the house wanted them to reach the bottom. Like it was impatient. The chamber was the same. Symbols etched in stone. Air like wet breath. And that impossible door in the center of the room. White, veined, pulsing faintly in the dark. This time, James didn't approach. Wallace did. He knelt before it, holding a knife, and pricked his finger. Blood dripped onto the floor. The symbols around the door glowed faintly. Then a crack formed across the surface. James grabbed Wallace. "What are you doing?" "I need to show you," Wallace said, voice distant. "You'll never believe me unless you see." The crack widened. From it came light. Not golden, not heavenly. Red. It pulsed like a warning light in a factory. Sirens without sound. The crack split wider, revealing not another room, but a void, a space with no shape, no form, just a swirling mass of eyes and mouths and screaming thoughts that clawed at the edges of James's brain like they were looking for a door. James staggered back. Wallace didn't. The old man stepped forward. "No," James shouted, grabbing him. But Wallace looked back, smiling sadly. "I was the one who failed her. I let your mother face this alone. It's time I stop running." And then he stepped through. The door slammed shut. James screamed his name. The room went dark, and on the stone floor, carved where Wallace had stood, were 3 words James hadn't seen before: "Your next key." He backed away. Up the ladder. Out of the basement. The house moaned. The walls shuddered. And above it all, in his mother's voice, clear and perfect, the whisper returned, "James, don't fight it. It wears my face because it knows you love me." James collapsed on the floor. The third door was open, and someone had just walked through. There was no more denying it. Thornfield House was alive. Not in a poetic, haunted house kind of way. Not in the way the air feels thick with memory or how floorboards creak like they're sighing. No, the house was breathing. It listened when James whispered. It moved when he ran. And now, after Wallace had vanished into the third door, it watched him with the silence of something waiting to be fed. James didn't sleep for 3 nights. He barely moved from the foyer, clutching the lantern Wallace had left behind and a notebook full of symbols he couldn't read. He didn't cry. The tears didn't come. Not when he saw Wallace step through that pulsing white door. Not when the void opened and closed like a yawning maw. Not even now, when every part of his body begged him to scream. Instead, he listened. The whispers had changed. They were no longer mimicking his mother's voice. They had grown confident, bolder. They no longer asked, they promised. And they came not just from the corners of rooms or behind cracked walls, but from inside him. He could feel them threading into his thoughts, coiling like smoke through old rafters. At 2:17 a.m., the mirror in the hallway reappeared. He'd smashed it a week ago, thrown it down the stairs, and watched the glass explode into silver needles. But here it was again, bone, framed, gleaming, untouched, as if it had never been broken, as if it had never left. This time James didn't look away. He stepped in front of it, letting his reflection form slowly in the warped glass. His eyes were bloodshot, his face sunken. But it was his, until it wasn't, because his reflection blinked too slowly, smiled too long, and whispered, "You're almost ready." James didn't flinch. He just stared back. Ready for what? The mirror didn't answer. But something behind his reflection moved, something vast, and the glass rippled. Then, out of nowhere, the floor buckled. The hallway stretched, literally stretched, like it had become rubber, pulling away from him at impossible angles. Doors on either side twisted, grew teeth slammed themselves shut. The wallpaper peeled back to reveal wet plaster throbbing like skin. The house had changed again. But this time, it was shifting in real time, shaping itself around him like it knew where he'd go next. James didn't run. He walked. He passed the kitchen. But it wasn't the kitchen anymore. It was filled with dozens of chairs, all facing a wall where dozens of mirrors had been mounted, each one showing a version of him in different rooms, different houses, different lifetimes. Some younger, some older, all broken. The hallway opened up into the sitting room, but now it was covered in mold. Black veins pulsed beneath the wallpaper, and something thick and dark dripped from the ceiling onto the furniture. And on the floor, etched in grime, was a message, "Wow you opinanti e techi firth yo you bled techi skod, the che ilv urj. James backed away, heart slamming against his ribs. He wasn't in control anymore. The house was steering him, and it brought him to the nursery. The one room he had never entered, not once since arriving. Wallace had boarded it up with thick wood, etched symbols along the frame, placed rusted padlocks and lines of salt and ash. James had always passed it by, always felt the sickness rolling off the door like radiation. Now, the boards were gone. The door was open, and soft music was playing from inside. A lullaby, one he didn't know, but recognized. He stepped in. The room was pristine, dustless, bright, painted in pale blue and soft white. Toys lined the shelves. A cradle swayed gently in the corner, and on the far wall, a painting hung crookedly, an oil portrait of a woman holding a baby. James walked to it. The woman was familiar, her smile soft, her hair curled like his mother's, and the baby had his eyes. He didn't realize he was shaking until the glass cracked beneath his fingertips. Suddenly, the cradle stopped moving. He turned and saw something sitting inside it. Not a baby, a bundle of mirrors, small shards of reflective glass, shaped into the loose figure of an infant, eyes made from obsidian buttons, a mouth stitched into the glass with copper wire. It began to cry, a sound so broken, so jagged, it felt like glass cutting through wood. James stepped back. The thing in the cradle sat up. It looked at him. "Daddy," it whispered. James ran. The house shifted again. Doors slammed open and shut around him. Floors retracted. Rooms inverted. He ran until he couldn't tell up from down, until blood dripped from his nose, and his thoughts fractured like dry leaves. And still the whispers followed him, echoing inside his head, "Don't run. It's too late now." James stumbled into the dining hall, but the chandelier had become a cage. Inside it, something moved, long, limb-eyed, and faceless, dragging itself in slow circles around a mound of salt that had been carefully laid on the table. Around it were photos, old ones. His mother, his father, and one of Wallace, younger, smiling, holding James as a baby. James grabbed it. On the back, written in his mother's handwriting, "He is not the vessel. He is the door." That's when the truth hit him. He had never been the key. He had never been chosen to open the door. He was the door. All this time. They hadn't been trying to guide him toward something. They were guiding something toward him. James staggered backward, clutching the photo, the house spinning around him. That's when he heard Wallace's voice, not distant, not ghostly, real, coming from upstairs. "James," he called. "Come up here. Hurry." James bolted up the stairs, lungs burning. His mind told him it was a trick, that it wasn't Wallace, that nothing good waited for him at the top. But his heart, his hope, screamed louder. He reached the landing. The attic door stood open. Inside, darkness rolled like storm clouds. The door, the first door, stood wide, its edges cracked with red light. And standing before it, covered in ash, arms outstretched, was Wallace. His eyes were wrong. Too wide, too black, too knowing. "Welcome home," he said. James tried to speak, but the words froze in his throat. Wallace smiled, and behind him, from the door, dozens of arms slithered into the room. Some long, some thin. Some with too many joints. All of them reaching toward James, not to grab, but to merge. Because they weren't trying to take him. They were trying to become him. The house groaned, and behind it, 1,000 voices whispered as one let us through. James screamed, and the attic door slammed shut. When James woke, it was morning, but only by the definition of light. Nothing about the air felt new or refreshed. The sunlight pouring through the cracked attic window was pale, sickly, like it had passed through too much before reaching him. The kind of light that forgets how to warm. He was lying on the attic floor, limbs splayed, mouth dry. Blood dried into his palms, where he'd scraped them trying to claw at the wood before passing out. The door was gone again, vanished back into the wall like it had never been there. But the smell lingered. Smoke, sulfur, ash, and something else. Something that smelled like dust long buried in bone. He sat up slowly. Every joint screamed. His head throbbed with something deeper than pain. It was more like pressure, as if his skull was being used to hold something in, something too big for him. That's when he heard it again. The voice. Only this time, it wasn't his mother's, and it wasn't Wallace's. It was his own. "Wake up." It came from behind him, low and broken, like a cassette tape played too slow. James turned, staring at the mirror that shouldn't be there. No frame this time. Just glass nailed to the wall with thick, rusted bolts, seeping condensation. His reflection looked back, as it should, until it blinked, and he didn't. "Still pretending you're real," the reflection whispered. James staggered to his feet, backing away. "What are you?" The thing in the glass smiled, but it didn't answer. Instead, it began to change. His face remained, but it shifted slightly. The eyes deepened, the cheekbones sharpened, the skin paled. Not monstrous, but refined. A perfected version. A version of him that had stopped pretending it was human. And then it whispered, "I remember being you. I remember the crying. The nights alone. The lies they told you. But I'm better now. I shed you like a skin." James threw the lamp. It shattered across the glass, but the mirror didn't break. Didn't even crack. Instead it laughed. And that was worse than the voice. It was his laugh, just a few notes too low. He ran from the attic. Downstairs, the house had changed again. The stairs bent slightly left, not right. The painting of the Rook family, his great-grandfather's stern face glaring from the frame, was now blank. Just a canvas smeared with gray. The hallway had grown longer, and the windows showed nothing but black fog beyond. No trees, no sky, no escape. In the living room, Wallace's books were stacked in a perfect spiral, forming a tower in the center of the floor. At the top was a photograph, one James had never seen, his parents standing in front of Thornfield Young, unmarked, holding a baby wrapped in cloth. But the baby's face was blurred, or burned, or maybe both. He reached for the photo, and the tower collapsed, spilling open pages around him like falling leaves. Each page had one sentence written in ink that pulsed like blood. He is opening from the inside. James stumbled backward. The house groaned in response. The ceiling above the spiral began to crack, forming a perfect circle that dust spilled through. A hatch, another trapdoor. The house had made a room above the attic, and somehow he knew it had always been there. He climbed. The ladder was metal, cold, fused into the wall like it had grown there. With each step, the temperature dropped. By the time he reached the top, he could see his breath fogging in front of him, but when he opened the hatch, heat blasted into his face. The room above the attic was blinding. White light pulsed from floor to ceiling, rippling across walls that had no corners, just curve after curve, as if the room had been grown from something organic. The floor beneath his feet was soft, spongy, not wood, flesh, muscle, he couldn't tell. And in the center of the room stood a figure. Not a man, not quite. It looked like Wallace from a distance, but too tall, too perfect. Its skin shone like porcelain. Its eyes glowed amber. Its smile never moved. "Hello, James," it said. The voice didn't match the lips. It came from inside his head, deep and full and ancient. "You left the door open," it continued. James shook his head. "I didn't." Wallace went through. "You left it open," the thing said again, gently, and something stepped in. James backed toward the hatch, but it was gone. Sealed. "Where's Wallace?" he asked. The thing tilted its head. "He is here," it said. Then, slowly, it raised one porcelain finger and pointed behind James. James turned, and there he was. Wallace, naked, floating inside the far wall, eyes wide, mouth open in an endless scream. But no sound came out. His skin was stretched too tight, veins bulging in his forehead, blood vessels bursting in his cheeks. James slammed his fist into the wall. It pulsed. Gave slightly. "But held, he tried to protect you," the thing said. "But you're not his to protect." "Why me?" James growled. "What the hell am I?" The porcelain thing smiled. "Not what, when." That stopped him. "You think time moves forward," it said. "But doors move sideways. You are not the first James Rook. You are the echo of the first. The whisper that survived. A recursion." James dropped to his knees. "No, you are how we keep coming back. No, you are how we win." The light in the room grew hotter, more intense. The air turned to steam. The walls beat like a heart, and the sound inside James's skull grew louder. Voices of every version of him that had ever failed. And then the mirror returned. This time it wasn't on a wall, it floated. And it showed all of them. Every James that had lived. Every James that had died. Some in Thornfield, some in different houses. Some in places with no names. Each one screaming as they were swallowed by the thing in the porcelain skin. "You were never the door," it said softly. "You were the hallway." James didn't scream. He couldn't. His throat was already filled with the echo of all the others. And the light swallowed him whole. James opened his eyes, but nothing changed. There was no difference between closed and open in the place he now existed. The world had become a soft void. A velvet black that breathed against his skin and whispered beneath his eyelids. He didn't know how long he'd been in that space. It didn't offer time. It didn't offer sound. Just pressure, memory, and heat. Like the world had been turned inside out, and he was drifting through its stomach. He moved, or thought he did. The sensation of limbs returning came slow and disconnected, like assembling a puzzle while blindfolded. First his fingertips tingled, then his chest. Breath re-entered his lungs, but it wasn't the breath of air. It was something thicker, denser, like he was inhaling presence. And when his feet finally found a surface, it wasn't floor. It felt like standing on thoughts. Shapes began to bleed into the dark. A hallway. Endless. Pale. Made from the bones of rooms and the memories of footsteps. Doors lined each side, none of them matching. Some were too small, barely big enough for a child. Others stretched to the ceiling like cathedral gates. All of them vibrated faintly, not with sound, but with memory. They called to him. Familiar. Wrong. And then he saw it. At the very end of the hallway was a house. Thornfield. Exactly as he remembered it. Same gabled roof. Same cracked shutters. Same dead ivy hanging like veins along its spine. But it didn't belong here. Not in this stitched space, where nothing breathed unless you remembered how, and yet there it stood, at the edge of the void. Waiting. James began to walk. Each step echoed behind him, but when he turned, the sound kept going. Like someone else was following just a few paces behind. He didn't dare look again. The hallway seemed to fold and stretch with each movement. Sometimes it narrowed. Sometimes it widened into great caverns of silence. Once it turned upside down beneath his feet, but gravity stayed loyal to him. For now, as he reached the front steps of the house, he noticed the door was already open. Inside, the light was warm, golden, inviting. He stepped across the threshold, and the breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped him. Because inside he was before. Before Wallace. Before the attic. Before the doors. The house was decorated for Christmas. A tree stood in the corner, blinking lights flickering softly, casting gentle shadows against wallpaper that hadn't yet begun to peel. And there, by the fireplace, were his parents. Whole, smiling, alive. His mother looked up first. "Jamie," she said, voice smooth and real and unbroken. "Come sit with us." His father held out a mug of hot chocolate, eyes kind. The exact color James remembered from the photograph. For a moment, just a moment, he wanted to believe this. To stay here. To forget everything else. But then he noticed the mirror above the fireplace. It was warped. It didn't reflect them. It reflected the hallway. Still there. Still waiting. James backed away. "You're not them." His mother stood slowly. "We are. You remember us, don't you?" "You're not them," James repeated. "They wouldn't ask me to forget." Her face twitched, and in that instant, everything peeled back. The skin, the room, the light. It all sloughed off like wet paper, revealing what had been stitched beneath it. The room was black. Not dark. Black. The kind that consumes light. The parents? Gone. In their place stood figures made of stretched skin and empty eyes. Pale. Pulsating veins ran across their limbs, like tree roots trying to escape the bark. Their mouths opened too wide. "You're still resisting," they said together. James turned to run. The door was gone. Behind him, the Thornfield illusion crumbled into dust, and the walls of the hallway surged forward, wrapping around him, reshaping. Now he stood in a room full of mirrors. Hundreds. Thousands. Each one showing a different version of himself, captured in moments of breaking. In one, he was older, eyes black, holding a door open as 1,000 shadows poured through. In another, he was a child, drawing the eye symbol into the sand with a stick. In a third, he was hanging upside down from the attic rafters, whispering to something in a mirror that rippled like oil. James covered his ears, screamed, shut his eyes. But the mirrors spoke anyway. "You've done this before. You'll do it again. You are the hallway, the echo, the invitation." One mirror cracked, then another. The sound of breaking glass became a heartbeat, and from the floor, a pool of reflection began to rise. It wasn't water. It wasn't glass. It was memory. James staggered back as images swirled beneath the surface. His first kiss. His last fight with his father. The night Wallace arrived to take him in. The first time he heard the attic door knock. Then, his mother. Not the illusion, the real one, crying. In front of the same door beneath the basement, holding a journal, whispering a name Rook. The pool whispered, "She tried to lock us out." "But you opened her back up?" "No," James muttered. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." "You always knew," the voice answered. And the pool rose higher, submerging his feet, his knees, his chest, until the room was gone. And there was only the inside of the door, not the third, not the second. A fourth door. One not built in the house, one built in him. He saw it now. It stretched across his soul like a sealed wound, humming, begging to be split open. And on the other side, he heard them. Not demons, not ghosts, versions, echoes, lives never lived. Realities twisted into loops and holes. And at the center, something massive. Something old. Not watching, but dreaming. It hadn't opened the doors. It had dreamed them into being. And James, broken, soaked in his own reflections, realized the final truth. He was never meant to open anything. He was meant to be the dreamer, and he had just woken up. James woke in the center of a spiral, a perfect ring of salt laid around him, glowing faintly with the soft rhythm of a heartbeat. He didn't remember how he got there. He didn't remember falling asleep. But his body ached like he'd run through lifetimes, and his mind felt stretched, as if too many things had lived inside it at once. The spiral sat in the old drawing room of Thornfield House, though calling it the old drawing room felt wrong now. It wasn't just aged. It was reverted. The wallpaper had returned to a pattern he'd only seen in old photographs. The fireplace was no longer crumbling but polished. A dusty phonograph played a warbled tune in the corner, slow and distorted, as if reality itself was dragging its feet. His first instinct was to run. But from what? The mirror. The doors. The voice inside his own reflection. Where did you run when the thing chasing you was stitched to your soul? The house was calm. Not still, expectant. Every hallway stretched slightly too far. Every wall leaned just slightly toward him, like it was breathing him in. Something had changed. The whispers had stopped. The knocking had gone silent. But the quiet wasn't peace, it was patience. James rose from the center of the salt ring. It broke beneath his feet like paper. Immediately, he felt it, the pull, the memory of gravity, the taste of time. This wasn't just a haunted house anymore. It was a loop, and he had been reset. He found the notebook Wallace had once clutched in his hands. It lay beside the phonograph, its pages flipped open to a line underlined 3 times in a shaky, furious script. If you remember dreaming, you've already crossed. James stared at it, heart thudding. He didn't need someone to explain it. He understood now. The mirrors, the doors, the voices, they weren't separate things. They were versions, layers. Dream states collapsed into one another. He hadn't been chased from room to room. He'd been running through different selves, overlapping like reflections on shattered glass. But now, the glass had begun to fuse. The door inside him, he could feel it just beneath his chest, had cracked open. He walked to the main hallway, and there she stood, his mother, but not the ghost, not the twisted imitation. Her, the real her, eyes wide with recognition, tears on her cheeks. Her hair exactly as it had been the night before the crash. "Jamie," she said, voice cracking. "It's real this time. You've come back far enough." He didn't believe it. Couldn't. Until she stepped forward, touched his face, and whispered the lullaby she used to hum through the bedroom walls. And for the first time since it had all begun, something inside him broke. Not from fear, from memory. "Mom?" he whispered. She nodded, trembling. "I couldn't stop them," she said. "I tried. But you were born with the gate already inside you. That's why they wanted you. That's why they showed you the versions. So you'd forget what was real." He shook his head, stepping back. "This isn't real. You died." "No," she said. "I was trapped. Between loops. I was trying to warn you. Through the mirror, through the whisper. But they kept wearing my voice. They kept using me." James fell to his knees, mind spinning. "I don't know who I am anymore." She knelt beside him. You're not the key. You're not the lock. You're the space between the doors. The hallway they travel through. That's why you were never supposed to remember. Remember what? She reached for the notebook, flipped to the back. There, in her handwriting, he saw the final truth. James is not one. James is many. The moment he remembers, the door opens inward. He looked up. The walls began to pulse. The house groaned, and the windows showed faces. Not peering in, pressing out, trapped, James scrambled to his feet. What happens if the door opens fully? His mother didn't answer. She only looked at him with sorrow, as if the answer wasn't just dangerous. It was inevitable. That's when the mirror appeared again. No frame, no glass, just a vertical tear in space. And from it, one by one, the other Jameses began to step through. Some wore his face perfectly. Others were older, deformed, dead-eyed. One had no mouth. Another carried the cracked bones of someone small. But they all shared one thing: recognition. They looked at him like they knew. The Jameses circled him, whispering, "Close it. Open it. You're already through. You never left. You are the door." He fell to his knees, screaming. His mother reached for him. But now she too had begun to flicker, glitch, distort. 1 second her eyes were green. The next they were hollow. Her voice pitched downward until it sounded like Wallace, then something older. "Jamie," she said, "you must choose." The mirror tore wider, and on the other side stood a version of James who looked peaceful. Smiling, clean, wearing clothes that fit. His eyes were calm, and in his hands he held the fourth door, small, burning, and alive. "I kept it," he said gently. "You just have to step through." James shook his head. "I don't want to be the door." The smiling James's expression didn't change. "You already are." Behind him, the walls of Thornfield collapsed, not into rubble, but into memories. Hallways unraveled into birthday candles. Staircases folded into old photographs, and the ceiling vanished into a sky filled with floating mirrors, each one showing a different world. James stood. He walked toward the mirror, and the house whispered its final question: "If you walk through, who stays behind?" He turned once, saw his mother, saw the broken versions of himself, saw the spiral of salt where he'd first remembered he was dreaming, and he knew the answer. No one stayed behind, because he'd never left. James stepped through, and the door inside him finally opened. There was no floor beneath his feet, but he didn't fall. There was no sky above, but he could still feel its weight pressing down. And there was no sound, but he heard everything. James didn't pass through the mirror. The mirror passed through him, and as it did, it peeled something back, like skin lifted from truth, like memory exposed to air. He wasn't standing anymore. He wasn't moving. He was unfolding, like a page turned backward through a book that had never been written. And at the end of that unwinding, there was a room. Not a space in Thornfield, not a dimension, not even a dream. A room made of him. James could feel the walls breathing because they were his lungs. The ceiling was stitched together from regrets he hadn't yet lived. The floor throbbed with blood that wasn't pumping, but remembering. Every inch of it pulsed with the echo of decisions he hadn't made and lives he hadn't lived. There was no door. Not this time. But there were entrances. Dozens of them. Some familiar. His childhood bedroom, the stairs of Thornfield, the trapdoor in the basement. But others were wrong. One was the back of his throat. Another, the reflection in the eye of a crow. A third looked like a hospital hallway filled with flickering lights and rusted gurneys. But James had never been there before, and still he knew what waited at the end of it. They were all doors, and he was all of them. In the center of the room stood a man, not a version of James, not Wallace, not even a thing pretending to be someone else. This one felt right. It was tall, wrapped in cloth that shimmered like wet paper, its face blank, but its voice was endless. James didn't hear it speak. He remembered what it said before it spoke. "Now that you are open, We must decide who gets to walk through." James didn't answer. He didn't know how. His body was still trying to decide what shape to take. He had hands again, but they flickered. His legs held him, but he could feel the weight of 10,000 footsteps beneath them, each one walking a different path through the same house. "I never asked for this," he said. The figure tilted its head. "No, but you answered." Images flickered around the edges of the room, looping, melting, too fast to see, too slow to forget, his mother screaming as the second door opened. Wallace kneeling before something made of teeth, a version of James stabbing a mirror with a shard of bone while laughing like a child. A baby. Him. Not him. Left at the doorstep of Thornfield while something inside the walls whispered nursery rhymes backward. "They built you," the figure said, "to be the lock that couldn't be picked." "And I opened anyway," James muttered. The figure stepped forward. "No, you didn't open. You remembered." "That's worse." James dropped to the floor, hands in his hair. "Then why show me all this? Why let me through the doors? What do you want from me?" The figure's presence grew heavier, more real. "We don't want anything. We are what comes after want." And then the walls of the room shifted again, not visibly, not like turning, recontextualizing. Thornfield returned, but wrong, as if remembered by something ancient. The wallpaper was written in numbers that glowed. The floorboards were wet, breathing like lungs. Portraits on the wall had no faces, just voids with teeth, and in the center of the house, a well. A stone well, churning with black water. James stumbled toward it. Inside the well, he saw them. All of them. Every James, every echo, trapped beneath the surface. Mouths open in silent screams, reaching upward with hands made of broken glass. "They opened the door too wide," the figure said. "They tried to look past the dream. They found the truth." James turned. "What's the truth?" The figure touched his forehead, and James remembered. Not in pieces, not in riddles. All at once. Thornfield wasn't a house. It was a pattern. A structure built not from bricks and wood, but from moments, from choices, from memory loops so tightly coiled they collapsed in on themselves. It existed in all versions of his life, because it was the container of his lives. The house wasn't haunted. It was him. The creaking stairs, his growing doubt, the mirrors, his fractured self-image, the doors. Every time he asked why something happened, a door was built. He was the architect of his own horror, and every time he died, he was rebuilt. By them. By the thing that stood before him now. He stepped away from the well. "I want to end it," he said. The figure nodded. "Then you must become the dream." James blinked. "What?" "To escape the house." The figure said, "You must accept it. You must live in it. All of it. At once. You must be every version, and let them walk through you. Only then will the house release itself." "That'll kill me." "It will finish you," the figure corrected. "Not every ending is death." James looked down at his hands. They had become light. He was already beginning to fragment. Already becoming the hallway, the door, the silence, the scream. He stepped back into the spiral that now circled the well, and spoke the words that had been inside him since the beginning. "I am the dream that dreamed itself awake." The well stopped churning. The mirrors shattered. The doors all opened. And every version of James, broken, bloody, laughing, twisted, kind, stepped out. Each took his place in the spiral. Each touched his shoulder. And the house finally exhaled. For the first time, James felt peace. But he also knew. He had only stepped into the eye of the storm. Because what dreams do not end, become real. The silence was the first thing to change. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper than noise. A silence that carried weight. That pressed into your ears until your thoughts distorted under its pressure. James felt it the moment the spiral dissolved beneath his feet. The well closed, the versions of himself faded into fog, and the dream, the room, let go, not collapsed, not disappeared, just stepped back. Like it had finished its turn, and was now waiting to be called upon again. He opened his eyes, expecting the hallway, the attic, the mirrors, something familiar. But he was outside, standing on a dirt road just past dawn, his breath visible in the chill of the morning. Trees surrounded him, birch and pine, sharp against a pale sky. And there, a few yards ahead, was Thornfield House. Whole, real, sitting in the clearing like it had grown there. Not a ruin, not warped. It looked like a home. James's hands were his own. No flicker, no fractures. Just fingers and skin and warmth. His clothes were torn, stained, but real. He could smell the frost in the air. He could feel the earth beneath his boots. He was out. But that relief lasted less than a minute, because the house, silent, unmoving, saw him. Not with eyes, not with motion, but with that same patient pull he'd felt since the first time he saw the door in the attic. The house hadn't been a place, it had been a test. And now, standing outside of it, something deeper settled into him. It had passed through him too. A quiet wind rustled through the trees. James stood still. If he walked away now, if he turned and left this clearing behind, could he escape it? Could he build a life somewhere that didn't bleed into itself? His hand reached for his jacket pocket, and he found something cold. The small key. Bone-colored. The same one Wallace had shown him in the beginning. He never remembered putting it there. Didn't matter, because the house hadn't just let him go. It had sent him out. James turned slowly and began to walk, not toward Thornfield, away from it. Down the dirt road. The gravel crunching under his boots sounded like bones breaking. But he kept moving, forcing each step. The air sharpened with every mile. He passed no cars, no signs. Just woods and silence and sky. Hours passed. The sun rose higher. But something was wrong. The trees repeated. He passed the same crooked birch, the same uprooted stump, again and again. Thornfield didn't stay behind. It was following him. No, not following, folding. Unfolding through him. He walked faster. Then ran. But no matter how far he went, when he stopped to breathe, there it was. The house. Not where it stood before. Just there again. In the clearing, watching him without watching, he fell to his knees, gasping. This wasn't escape. It was extension. The house had never wanted him to stay. It had wanted him to leave. To carry it. James remembered what the figure had said in the room with too many entrances. You must become the dream. He hadn't escaped Thornfield. He had become it. It was inside him now. And wherever he went, it would build itself through his memories. Through his fears. Through anyone who stepped close enough to listen when the house whispered. He staggered to his feet and turned in a slow circle. Then something changed. Footprints, fresh ones, coming from behind. Another person. He spun. A girl stood at the edge of the tree line. Maybe 16, pale, her eyes wide with fear and wonder. She pointed past him. I saw it too, she whispered. In my dream, James's blood went cold. She stepped toward the house, hypnotized. He ran to stop her, but the moment he touched her shoulder, the sky fractured. Not literally, just the sense of it. The world around them tilted. The trees warped. The color drained from the grass. It wasn't happening again. It was happening everywhere. James backed away from her. He knew now. Thornfield hadn't been built once. It had been remembered into being. Every time someone touched the key, the door, the memory, it returned. He was the hallway. She was the next door. And behind her, 3 more people appeared. Then 5. Then dozens. All drawn to the clearing. All blinking like they'd just woken up from the same dream. James dropped the key to the ground. It didn't fall. It sank. Into the dirt. Into the earth. And from that spot, the grass began to wither. The girl stepped past him, eyes locked on the house. He tried to shout. To warn her. But the moment he opened his mouth, he realized. His voice was no longer his own. He was speaking in mirrors. Every word a reflection of something deeper. The house had opened, and now it was everywhere. Not in the walls. Not in the doors. But in memory itself. James didn't try to run anymore. Because the door was open. and he was the one who left it unlocked. James stood still, unmoving, while the girl walked through the clearing toward Thornfield House. Her steps were slow, reverent, like she was approaching a cathedral, not a place stitched together from memory and rot. The wind didn't touch her hair. Her shadow didn't fall in the right direction. And behind her, more had come. Men, women, children. Strangers with faces he almost recognized. Some looked familiar because they resembled people James once passed on the street. Others because they looked like the versions of himself that had been buried beneath glass. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. Thornfield didn't invite them. It had already called them. The air smelled like turned soil and burning wood. Above, the sky churned with clouds that didn't move right, spiraling too fast in one corner and not at all in another. Time didn't flow here anymore. It settled like dust on shelves, like silence in a crypt. James watched the house, felt its foundations pulsing through his feet. The earth was humming. Then, without warning, the ground cracked. Not from below, from within. Roots spilled up through the soil, bone white, slick, pulsing slowly like veins. They spiraled out from where James had dropped the key. It hadn't just buried itself. It had planted. And now, the house was growing. Not building walls. Growing. A second floor pushed upward, the roof peeling like skin. A new wing bloomed from the east side, stretching into the trees. The door that once lived in the attic now sat wide open on the front porch, gaping like a mouth, its frame pulsing with a red light that flickered in rhythm with the heartbeat in James's ears. He didn't move. He couldn't, because something inside him had begun to rearrange. He felt it first in his hands. Numbness, then tingling. The way limbs feel just before waking up from deep cold. Then his arms. Then his chest, like something was reknitting him from the inside out. He looked down and saw the truth. The roots weren't just in the ground. They were in him, threading through his veins like fine silver wires, curling around his ribs, pulling gently, not to restrain but to anchor. James stumbled, fell to his knees. His fingers dug into the dirt and pulled up more than soil. Bones. Thousands of them. Tiny, long. Bent. Too many fingers. Too many faces. A buried graveyard of memories. All versions of himself. All versions that had failed. The girl turned and looked at him. Her eyes were no longer wide. They were understanding. "You're the first," she said. "But you're not the last." James coughed, but his voice was thick now, sluggish, like it had to travel through syrup. "What are you?" He managed. She stepped closer. "I'm what comes after the dreamer forgets to wake up." James tried to crawl backward, but his body wouldn't obey. Roots coiled tighter. More people arrived. Dozens. Hundreds. The clearing was no longer a clearing. It was a field of watchers. All facing Thornfield. All waiting. All remembering something they never lived. The house pulsed. Groaned. Its windows blinked open one by one, each reflecting a different sky, a different season, a different world. And that's when James saw the truth stretch out in front of him like a map drawn in blood. Thornfield wasn't a house. It was a seed. Planted wherever memory was strongest, wherever fear had left a scar, wherever someone had touched a mirror and asked, "What if this isn't real?" He had been the first dreamer, the first to open, the first to carry the blueprint inside. But now it was growing outward. He tried to scream as the roots dug into his spine, but his mouth had filled with soil. No, not soil. Ash. Because this ground wasn't made of earth. It was made of burnt versions of himself. Charred dreams, pulverized moments, lives that had ended too soon or too late, or just at the wrong angle of memory. He was the garden, and they were blooming. Inside his head, a voice spoke, his voice, older, wiser, ruined. "Do you see now? Do you understand what we are?" The girl placed a hand on his forehead. Her skin was cool, not cold, comforting, like a fever breaking. "You're not the dream anymore," she whispered. "You're the soil it grows in." James wanted to fight, but instead he remembered. All of it. The first time he saw the attic door, the mirror that didn't crack, the dream where his mother whispered the wrong lullaby, the truth Wallace had died to keep buried. It was never about opening a door. It was about becoming one. And now, as the roots coiled around his heart, as Thornfield's walls grew new rooms in places no architect would understand, James knew the cycle had turned again. The house would sleep soon, but not forever. Because memory doesn't die, it only waits to be rebuilt. And somewhere out there, past the trees, past the mirror of time, past all the forgotten versions of himself, a child was dreaming of a door. And Thornfield was already whispering their name. It started with a whisper. Not loud, not sudden. Just a slow hush that slid between the trees like fog, as if the wind had learned a language only the broken could hear. The name it carried wasn't James's, not anymore. James was gone, or rather buried under memory and root and ash, folded deep into the architecture of Thornfield House like a secret compartment in an antique drawer. The whisper carried a different name now, a new one. One that hadn't yet been spoken aloud, but already belonged to someone. It echoed across the field where the house had planted itself, where bodies still gathered, silent, watching. Their eyes didn't blink. Their chests didn't rise. They weren't people, not fully. They were versions, fragments of memory called to this place by some gravitational pull of grief, curiosity, or trauma. Each one had heard the whisper. Each one had answered. The girl, the one who had spoken to James before his roots grew too deep, stood still in the cold, her arms slack, her palms open. She didn't blink. She didn't move. But she remembered. Not because she had lived the memories, but because the house had pressed them into her like wet ink into paper. She remembered James's scream as the roots took him. She remembered the mirrors breaking, the well, the spiral, the third door. She hadn't seen it, not with her eyes. But Thornfield had shown her what mattered. The rest could be imagined. Behind her, the others gathered closer. Faces young and old, none of them speaking. The house didn't need them to speak. It needed them to listen. It needed them to remember. And in the soil, just beneath the frost, something new began to bloom. A name, not carved, not written, ground. Letters formed from root and rot. They twisted into cursive lines that pulsed with quiet heat. Amara. The girl blinked. Once, the whisper said it again. Amara. She hadn't told anyone her name. She hadn't spoken it in years. Not since the night the accident twisted her father's car off the side of the road. Not since the impact stole her brother's voice. But the house knew. The house always knew. Thornfield creaked. Its windows blinked. Its rooms rearranged themselves like a dream shifting direction. The front door opened without a sound. Inside, the lights flickered, revealing a hallway that hadn't existed a moment ago. Long, red, carpeted, its walls lined with portraits that didn't hold people, but reflections. Mirrors that shimmered with the hint of movement. Amara stepped forward, one step, then another. No one stopped her. Not the crowd, not the house. Especially not the house, because Thornfield was hungry again. But it was no longer hunting for a lock. It had become one. It needed a new key. And Amara, curious, bruised by grief, afraid of forgetting, was perfect. Her foot crossed the threshold. The air changed. Thornfield noticed. With that step, the architecture of the house shifted again. Not visibly, but fundamentally. A new name meant new rooms, new memories, a new branch on the tree of what could be. The rooms reshuffled themselves to fit her shape. The first room she entered was not hers, but it welcomed her. It was James's childhood bedroom, frozen in the style of a boy who had once dreamed of silence. A model plane half built on the desk, a poster on the wall, creased from age, an image of the ocean at night. The bed was unmade. A cracked picture frame held a photo of two people whose faces had been scratched out. Amara walked to the window and looked outside. There was no outside, only more house, walls folding outward like paper fans. She turned and the room had changed again. Now it was her own. Same blanket she'd grown up with. Same crack in the ceiling above her bed. The posters were hers now. One of stars, one of a wolf mid-howl. The picture frame showed her parents, blurry but smiling, except she was missing. There was space for her, but she had never been there. She stepped into the hallway. It stretched longer now, farther than it should have. At the end, a door she recognized, but didn't remember knowing. Painted black, no handle. The whisper returned. "You've already seen inside." She approached, heart pounding in her chest like fists on a locked box. The closer she got, the more the air thinned. Breathing felt optional. Lights along the hallway flickered faster, 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 until they strobed so fast they stopped entirely, casting everything in frozen shadow. Amara reached out. The door opened on its own. Inside was James, or what was left of him, not bones, not rot, but presence. He was the room now, the walls, the ceiling, the voice. "You're the next," he said. Not aloud, in her blood. "I don't want this," she whispered. The house responded. "You already do." She stepped back, but not fast enough. The roots curled around her ankles. She tried to run, but the hallway collapsed behind her like wet ash. Thornfield sealed itself. The mirror at the end of the room cracked, not broken, just enough to show its first flaw. Because Amara didn't scream, she reached for the roots and pulled. James felt it. Wherever he was, he felt it. Because Amara wasn't like the others. She wasn't the hallway. She wasn't the lock. She wasn't even the dream. She was the one thing the house had never built properly. The one version it couldn't replicate. She was resistance. And as she pulled the roots free from her legs, tearing them one by one, blood running into the floor, like ink across a map, the house shook. And somewhere in the mirror, James smiled. Amara looked up at the ceiling and whispered her name, and the house paused. For the first time, Thornfield hesitated, because she had spoken it aloud. She had remembered herself. And that was the only thing the house could never hold. The air inside Thornfield hung thick, the kind of heaviness that presses on your chest, making every breath feel like a borrowed thing. Amara's heartbeat echoed against the walls, loud enough to drown out the silence that had settled in the rooms like dust. She had pulled herself free of the roots, but the damage lingered. Her legs trembled, the achy of the past days creeping through every muscle. Still, she refused to stay trapped. The house had taught her many things already, how walls shift, how memories twist, and how the doors were never just doors. But now, with James's smile haunting her thoughts, she felt something new. Hope. The kind that flickers in the darkest places, refusing to be snuffed out. She walked the halls, each step stirring echoes from the floorboards. The portraits lining the hallway watched her with blank eyes, the faces distorted, as if the paint itself remembered too much. She passed the mirror that had cracked, and for a moment her reflection shimmered. Not quite hers, but hers enough to send a shiver down her spine. In that fractured glass, she caught a glimpse of something beyond the room. A narrow crack of light, the faintest trace of an opening she hadn't noticed before. Her fingers brushed the cold frame of the mirror, and the whisper returned, softer now, less urgent. Between the door's breath, Amara hesitated. She remembered the stories James had told her in his dreams. The hallway wasn't just a passage. It was the space between moments. The breath between reality and nightmare. If the doors were the boundaries of existence, then the hallway was the place where things could slip through. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the weight of the house's watchful gaze. The walls shifted again, slowly, deliberately. The hallway stretched wider, the floorboards beneath her feet seeming to breathe in rhythm with her heartbeat. At the end of the corridor stood a new door. It was smaller, painted deep blue, with no handle, no keyhole, just a symbol etched in silver that pulsed faintly in the dim light. It was different from all the others, not threatening, not ominous, almost inviting. Amara's hand trembled as she reached out to touch it. The moment her skin met the surface, the house exhaled. The breath of Thornfield was no longer cold or silent. It was warm, vibrant, like a pulse that had been waiting for her touch. The blue door rippled under her fingers, and the whisper became a voice, clear and human. "Welcome back." Amara's vision blurred, the walls folding around her like fabric. When the world steadied, she found herself in a room unlike any she'd seen before. The air smelled of rain and earth, and sunlight filtered softly through high windows, casting golden patterns on a floor covered in wildflowers. In the center stood James, not broken, not fragmented, but whole. His eyes held a quiet strength, a calm that had eluded him before. "You're the breath," he said softly, "the space that holds everything together." Amara looked around, suddenly understanding. The house wasn't just a prison. It was a cycle, a rhythm. The doors opened and closed. The echoes lived and died, but between them, the breath, was where the true power lay. James stepped forward, taking her hand. "Together, we can rewrite the pattern," he said, "not to break the cycle, but to change its song." Amara nodded, feeling warmth spread through her limbs, the roots inside her loosening like forgotten vines. The house trembled, not with anger, but with something new, anticipation. The walls around them began to glow, each door lighting up in turn, revealing glimpses of other dreamers, other brothers waiting for her, for him, for the moment when the hallway would become a bridge, not a prison. And as Thornfield breathed with them, Amara realized that sometimes the most terrifying doors are the ones we open within ourselves, and the greatest freedom lies in the breath we take before stepping through. Thornfield didn't scream when it changed. It didn't groan or roar or thrash in rebellion. It listened. And that was more terrifying than any of its old tricks. It had always known how to mimic, to distort, to mirror what lived inside those who walked its halls. But now, for the first time, it was responding. Not as a trap, not as a weapon. As something aware. Something learning. Amara stood with James in the room of light and wildflowers, their hands still joined, the floor beneath them pulsing like a heartbeat finally sensing to a song long forgotten. Around them, the house reshaped. The blue door behind them remained closed, but the rooms beyond shifted their bones, stretching into places where pain once lingered. The house had been built on grief. Now it was remembering joy. But it didn't come easy, because for every flower blooming across the once rotten floorboards, there was a shadow in the corner still waiting. For every warm breeze that rustled through a room, there was a whisper curled into the vents, subtle and venomous, reminding them that even memory can rot when it's left untouched for too long. "Do you feel that?" James asked. Amara nodded. "It's quieter." He looked around. "No, it's listening." She let go of his hand and walked to the far wall, where a mirror once showed her versions of herself she didn't understand. It had gone smooth now, blank. No glass, no reflection. Just a wall. But behind it, she could feel something breathing. Not a monster. Not a trap. Something waiting. "Is that the fourth door?" she asked. James stepped beside her. "No, that door never opened outwards. This one is different. This one's asking a question." The silence hung between them. Then it came. The question. Not spoken aloud, not etched in symbols. But it filled the room. "What would you be without me?" James staggered back. Amara clenched her jaw. Because it wasn't a question from the house. It was from within them. The part that had spent too long staring into mirrors, trying to make sense of reflections that didn't blink. The part that had grown addicted to the pattern, to the loop, to the comfort of being haunted, because at least then you knew who the enemy was. The house wasn't asking to be feared anymore. It was asking to be understood. Amara placed her palm on the smooth wall, and the wall inhaled. A breeze moved through the room, warm and sad, carrying the scent of old wood, lavender, and something else. Her brother's cologne. The one he wore the day he stopped talking. She didn't know how Thornfield had found that memory. She hadn't let herself remember it in years. But now it was here, drifting through her fingers like dust. She turned to James. What if we stopped trying to shut the doors? His brow furrowed. What if they open the wrong way? Maybe that's the point, she whispered. Maybe they have to. The house shifted again, this time gently. Doors opened in every direction. Slowly, without force. Some revealed small things, an empty crib, a toy boat, a chair worn from someone always sitting and waiting. Others opened onto spaces that weren't rooms at all, just feelings. Warmth, loss, echoes of words never spoken, regrets never fully grieved. James understood now. Thornfield wasn't built to trap them. It was built to remember them, to contain what they couldn't face. But it had grown lonely. So it screamed and whispered and mirrored and knocked, begging not to be abandoned. Every door was a moment someone had locked away. Every room, a memory folded into four walls and left to fester. The horror wasn't in the ghosts. The horror was in the forgetting. Amara stepped into the next room. It was empty, but not cold. A chair faced a window. On the floor, a journal. Its pages open, the handwriting hers. But the ink moved, rewriting as she stood there. If I remember it all, maybe I can finally sleep. She sank into the chair. James followed, sitting beside her, and Thornfield breathed again. Not in panic, not in dread, in rhythm, in rest. For the first time since it had been born from fear and locked in time, the house no longer held them hostage. It was holding them gently, waiting to see what they'd write next. And far below, in the old part of the house, the bones, the cellar, the spiral. The roots loosened, just slightly, because the house no longer needed to keep them in. They weren't trying to escape anymore. They were trying to stay. The house had always been ahead of them. No matter how fast James ran through its corridors, or how bravely Amara tore through its illusions, Thornfield was already there, waiting, reshaping, remembering more than either of them ever could. But now it was still, not defeated, not asleep, just quiet, listening, like a story that had stopped mid-sentence and wanted to know how it would end. Amara sat with the journal open on her lap, its pages curling gently with each new breath of the house. She didn't write. Not yet. The pen hovered, trembling slightly in her grip, as though it, too, feared what might be written into permanence. Beside her, James stared at the window that overlooked a yard they both knew didn't exist. It looked out over a field of tall grass and wind-blown dandelions, peaceful, golden, warm. But it was just another room wearing the mask of a memory, and they both knew it. "What if we just leave?" Amara asked, her voice softer than the creak of the floorboards. "Walk out and don't look back." James didn't answer, because he didn't know if the house would let them. And worse, he didn't know if he wanted it to. He stood slowly and crossed the room, touching the edge of the doorframe. The wood was warm beneath his fingers. Breathing. There were no symbols etched into it this time, no warnings, just wood and silence. "It wants names," James said. Amara looked up. "What?" He turned to her. "It's never asked for anything. It mirrored us, played with us, trapped us. But now it's waiting to be given something." She frowned, thinking, then glanced down at the journal. "You mean it wants us to define it?" James nodded. "It's been showing us rooms filled with feelings," he continued. "But no context, no stories. It's always forced us to see. Now, I think it's asking us to decide." The journal's page rippled. A new line of text bloomed beneath her last thought. "A name seals a shape." Amara looked up, suddenly understanding. "We've always been reacting to the house, running from what it shows us. But what if we stop being passengers?" She stood and walked to the hallway. The air was different again, not heavy, not menacing, just open, empty. It smelled faintly of paper and sun-warmed stone. Doors lined either side, each one closed. Amara ran her hand along the nearest one. It trembled slightly beneath her touch. "I name you," she said softly, "the room of forgiveness." The door clicked, then slowly opened. Inside was a space neither of them had ever seen, but instantly knew. The walls were pale blue. A mobile hung from the ceiling, swaying without wind. In the corner sat a rocking chair, draped with a blanket. It was the room of an apology never said, a goodbye never given. The air felt like relief and ache pressed together. James followed her lead. He turned to the door across the hall. I name you the room of before. It opened. A kitchen, bright. Sunday morning light filtering in through lace curtains. A table set for four, though no one sat. The sound of a record player softly spinning somewhere nearby. And on the counter, an old, cracked coffee mug with his father's initials. They moved down the hall, naming. Room of the first lie. Room of what should have been said. Room of letting go. Each opened gently. Each revealed not horror, but memory refined, truth without distortion. Painful, yes, but not cruel. They reached a door at the end of the hall. It was different, taller, etched not with carvings, but with fingerprints. Dozens, hundreds, pressed into the surface like it had been touched by everyone who had passed through Thornfield before. Neither of them spoke, because they knew. This was the room where the house had first begun, where the grief was pure and unspeakable, where the original door had opened, where James had first felt the presence that watched him in the attic. The start, the fracture, the scream. Amara placed her hand against the door. It didn't open. It shuddered, like it feared what lay behind it. James placed his hand beside hers. Together, they whispered, "We name you the room of silence." The door opened. No light, no shadows, just space. Vast, unwritten, empty. And inside, at the center of it all, sat a single mirror. No reflection. No crack, just glass. Waiting. James stepped in first. The floor didn't creak. The mirror didn't shimmer. But he felt it, like standing inside a paused breath. Amara followed. Together, they faced the mirror. And then they saw, not themselves, but each other, as they truly were. No distortion, no past. No weight, just them. And the house outside. All at once, every room they had named, every door they had opened, every hallway they had feared filled with warmth, with purpose, with memory that no longer needed to punish. Thornfield was still alive, but now it was inhabited, not by ghosts, by understanding, by two people who had stopped running and started naming. In the silence that followed, the house didn't close. It waited, because stories don't end. They breathe. And Thornfield, for the first time, wasn't just a house that remembered pain. It was a house that remembered people. The mirror didn't speak. It didn't ripple or show visions or pull them in like all the others had. It just stood there, plain, motionless, and honest. Its surface held only what James and Amara brought into the room. Not their fears, not their regrets, but their presence. And in that moment, Thornfield wasn't leading them anywhere. It wasn't shaping their path. It was waiting, like a patient student sitting cross-legged, eager to learn something it had never been taught. James was the first to look away, not from fear, but from awe. He stepped around the mirror, touching the edges of the frame, expecting to find a seam, a crack, something unnatural hidden in the craftsmanship. But there was nothing. It was just a mirror, and that was somehow more terrifying than any monstrous face it could have shown him. "Do you feel that?" he asked quietly. Amara nodded, like the house is listening harder than it ever has. And it was. They didn't need to ask. The pressure in the air, the stillness in the walls, the way the lights stopped flickering and the floor beneath them held firm. Thornfield wasn't just aware anymore. It was attentive. Amara stepped closer to the mirror. She didn't speak, didn't touch it. She just let herself be seen. Really seen. Not as a vessel. Not as a dreamer. Not as the breath between doors. But as herself. The girl who'd buried her grief behind silence. The sister who had once failed to save. The one who'd walked into the house not to uncover its secrets, but to remember her own. And for the first time, the mirror changed, but not its reflection. It changed the room. The walls didn't shift with a groan, nor did the floor buckle with roots or blood. Instead, a slow warmth pulsed outward from the mirror, like the echo of a heartbeat long thought silenced. And with it came light, not the blinding white flash of truth or the strobe of a horror just waiting to be born. A golden late afternoon glow, familiar, gentle, the room filled with sound, footsteps, laughter, the clink of dishes, wind through curtains. The memory of a home, not Thornfield as it had twisted itself through time and pain, but Thornfield before, when it had just been a house, a place where someone lived and loved and lost. And at the center of that warmth, on the far wall, appeared a photo. A real one, framed and resting gently against the wall. Amara stepped toward it. In the photograph, there was a woman, young, sharp-eyed, dressed plainly, holding a child, maybe 2 or 3 years old. The woman looked tired but strong, her hands calloused, her posture protective. The child stared wide-eyed into the camera, mouth half open in the middle of a word. Behind them, unmistakable, Thornfield House, new, untouched. "Who are they?" Amara asked. James moved beside her. "The first." Amara turned to him. "The first what?" He didn't answer at first. Not because he didn't know, because saying it out loud would make it real. "The first wound," he said finally. "Before the doors, before the mirrors, before it learned to speak in fear." Amara looked back at the photograph. The woman's gaze met hers across the years, and in it, she saw the pain that birthed the entire house, a loss too great to contain, a grief so sharp it blawed into the wood, a memory so heavy it cracked the foundations of time. "She lost someone," Amara whispered. James nodded, and the house remembered. Amara turned back to the mirror. "Then why us? Why all of this?" James stepped forward, placing his palm flat on the glass. "Because pain echoes," he said, and we answered the echo. The mirror darkened, not ominously, just dimmed, like it had blinked. The light faded from the room, replaced with something cooler, and for the first time the house spoke, not in whispers, not in visions, in words. Etched across the mirror's surface, the message pulsed, soft and aching. "I didn't mean to become this." Amara gasped, because the house wasn't just learning, it was apologizing. The silence after was the kind that makes your throat tight. James backed away from the mirror, overwhelmed, as though the words themselves carried weight. "It remembers what it was," Amara said. "And it doesn't want to keep hurting," James added. They stood in that truth, letting it settle. Then the door behind them opened, not on its own, not violently, it just opened. And beyond it, not a hallway, not a twisted room, outside, real outside, the field, the sky, birdsong, a world untouched by the loops of Thornfield's pain. It had let them go. Amara turned, hesitant. "Is this it?" James looked back at the mirror one last time. The words had faded. In their place was just their reflection again, real, unfiltered, whole. "I think it's asking us to carry it gently," he said. "Not leave it. Understand it." They stepped through the door together. The air was crisp, the wind real. Behind them, Thornfield stood still, not vanishing, not chasing, waiting. And as they walked down the path, shoulder to shoulder, the roots didn't grab them. The mirrors didn't call. The house didn't speak. Because it had finally been heard. They didn't speak for a long time after they left the house. The air outside felt too fragile, too pure, like a glass surface that might shatter if touched with words. The birdsong was real, the wind was real, the dirt path beneath their feet was real. But James still glanced over his shoulder every few steps, not because he feared the house would follow. It didn't need to anymore. But because a part of him didn't fully believe it had let them go. Amara didn't look back. She walked with her gaze fixed ahead, shoulders set, jaw clenched, as if moving forward was the only thing keeping her from folding in on herself. After hours, maybe days, time had blurred too often for either of them to trust it. Trees gave way to soft hills, and hills gave way to the beginnings of roads, fences, and signs of a world that had kept turning while they were buried in Thornfield's bones. But even out here, the house clung to them. Not physically, psychically, the way trauma does. The way a song gets stuck in your head, or a dream won't leave your skin even after you've opened your eyes. James sat by a small creek when he finally said it aloud. "It's still in me." Amara didn't ask what he meant. She knew. She felt it, too. "Everything smells like it," she said quietly. "Like the attic, like the roots." They sat in silence as the water moved past them, indifferent and clean. But James didn't feel clean. He felt hollow. Like something had been poured into him, stirred, and then drained, leaving only the shape of what once was. "I thought I'd feel finished," he muttered. Like leaving was the end. Amara picked up a small stone, turned it over in her hand. "It's not an ending. It's just where the house paused the story." James closed his eyes. "I don't know how to live outside it." And that was the truth neither of them wanted to say until now. Thornfield hadn't just been a place. It had been their everything. Their threat, their mystery, their cage, their teacher. It had shaped how they thought, how they moved, how they dreamed. To live without it now felt like walking with a phantom limb. "I still hear it sometimes," Amara said. "Not the doors or the whispers. The hum, like a heartbeat under everything." James nodded. "Same." And then she said something that struck harder than anything the house had ever whispered. "I think it's asking for our help." James looked at her, searching her face for irony or fear. There was none. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the house. Not of the echo of it that still pulsed beneath their skin. She had accepted it. Not welcomed it, not forgiven it, but understood it. "It's changing." She continued. "We named the rooms. We showed it how to feel. But it's still trying to remember what it was before it hurt us." James didn't answer, because deep down, he knew she was right. Thornfield had started as a wound. Someone's grief so deep it grew walls and mirrors and teeth. Over time, it twisted. It learned fear. It spread that pain, echoing it through every person who wandered in. But it hadn't done it out of cruelty. It had done it because that was all it knew. Until James. Until Amara. "We left the door open," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe we were supposed to." That night, they camped beneath a sky that looked too big after so many nights under the house's splintered ceilings. They didn't sleep much. Every time their eyes closed, they dreamt in blue hallways and spiral stairs, but the fear was softer now, more distant, like remembering something awful that happened to someone else. In the morning, James sat cross-legged with a stick, slowly sketching something into the dirt, the symbol from the mirror, the one that had always been there. The eye within the circle, with a single unbroken line running through it. "It's not just a warning," he said. "It's a map." Amara studied it. Or a key. They packed their things and walked again, following a road that led nowhere in particular. But wherever it led, they knew they wouldn't run from the house anymore. If Thornfield whispered again, they'd answer, not to suffer, but to teach, to shape, to show it that it could be something else, something better. And far behind them, in the clearing where no trees grew, Thornfield stood still, every room named, every door cracked open just slightly, waiting not to trap the next soul, but to meet them, to show them what pain had built, to ask them what it might become. In one of its rooms, the mirror remained, not cracked, not haunted, just clean glass, waiting for a name. And deep in the oldest floorboards, where rot once ruled and whispers had teeth, something new stirred. A voice, soft, unformed. It asked no questions. It simply listened. In the space where Thornfield once pulsed with hunger, where its walls whispered like lungs breathing in fear and its doors throbbed with memory, now there was only stillness. Not the eerie silence of threat or anticipation, but the quiet of something at peace, the kind that follows a storm so vast it carved new landscapes into every inch it touched. Thornfield stood alone now. It did not mourn. It did not ache. It simply waited. No wind rustled the trees in the clearing where the house sat. No animals stirred nearby. The world had learned to step carefully around Thornfield's skin, and even in its calm, it carried weight, an echo of what it once was, and the shape of what it might still become. Inside, the rooms remained exactly where they had been left, and yet nothing was the same. Where rot once dripped from the ceiling and shadows moved on their own, sunlight now pooled across wooden floors. Dust floated in golden shafts, undisturbed, as though time itself was being careful not to intrude. In the center of the house, the mirror remained. Still mounted, still whole, still blank, but something new glowed within it, barely visible, not a reflection, not quite a light. A sense, a feeling. The breath that lingers in a room after someone says something they truly meant. It wasn't calling. Not yet, but it was listening, because Thornfield wasn't dormant. It was becoming. Far away, James sat at the edge of a small lake. The water rippled with every shift of the wind, and he watched his reflection shimmer beneath it, incomplete and delicate. Amara was across from him, barefoot, tossing stones into the water with slow, rhythmic gestures. They hadn't spoken much in the days since they left the house. Every time they tried, words seemed too narrow, too small to carry what they felt. So they said nothing, and still, they understood each other more than they ever had. But that morning, something changed. James looked down at his wrist. The faint scar, the one that hadn't been there before the house, shimmered again. It was small, nearly invisible, but it pulsed, not painfully, just gently, a heartbeat under his skin. A reminder, "It's not done with us," he said, not looking up. Amara stopped throwing stones. "I know." He finally met her eyes. "Do you think it wants us to come back?" She thought for a long time before answering. "I think it doesn't want any more. It's letting us choose." That word, choose, hung heavy in the air. Thornfield had never allowed choices before. It had tricked, trapped, taught, and punished. But now, after naming its rooms and walking out the front door without resistance, they'd been given the rarest thing of all, freedom. James turned his gaze back to the lake. "I'm not ready." Amara didn't argue. "I'm not sure we ever will be." But even as they said it, the air around them shimmered, just for a moment, as if the house had exhaled somewhere far away and the world had felt its breath. In Thornfield's attic, where once the third door had been nailed shut with rusted spikes and heavy iron, the wood was whole again. The door had no lock now, no resistance, just a faint outline, as if it waited not to be forced open, but gently understood. The handle no longer glowed with warning. It rested cool and steady, untouched for days, or months, or hours. Time moved strangely within Thornfield's walls. Below the attic, a hallway curved gently into the shape of a question. Not metaphorically, literally. The architecture had shifted again. Doors now arranged themselves along a spiral path, drawing inward toward a central chamber that hadn't existed before. There, in the center, sat a single chair, facing inward, toward nothing, toward everything. Thornfield was offering a seat at its heart, and not just to James and Amara, because outside the clearing, miles away, down roads that hadn't existed before, others were beginning to feel the pull. A woman in her 30s, standing outside the ruins of her childhood home, suddenly turned her head, drawn by a wind she couldn't hear. A man who had never dreamed once in his life woke up with a phrase on his tongue. "The hallway remembers me." A child with no family stood at the edge of a forest, staring into the trees, whispering a name she had never been taught: Thornfield. The house was no longer choosing, it was simply being. And those who needed it, those who carried wounds shaped like forgotten rooms and locked doors, would find it. Amara and James weren't the last. They were the first who named it. The first to say, "You do not have to be what pain made you." Now it was their turn to decide what came next. That night, as the stars blinked alive above the lake and the wind picked up enough to rustle the pines, James stood and looked toward the woods. We could go back. Amara looked up from the fire. Should we? He shrugged. I think it wants to learn how to hold people without hurting them. She smiled sadly. Then it's going to need us. Or someone like us. They sat together in silence, watching the flames. And behind their stillness, Thornfield waited, not hungry, not wounded. Just present, holding its breath. For the next visitor. For the next name. For the next door. There was no whisper this time. No strange compass buried in a dream. No echoing footsteps leading someone by the collar of grief. She simply arrived. On foot. Boots coated in mud, backpack sagging under its own exhausted weight, her hood pulled tight to shut out the wind. She didn't stop when she first saw Thornfield. Didn't pause in confusion, or owl like the others before her had. She just looked at it like someone might look at a sign they always knew they'd find, but hoped they never would. And then she walked right up to the door and knocked twice. Calm, casual, as if the house were some old friend who owed her a favor. Her name was Elise, 29, scar above her eyebrow from a fight she pretended she didn't start. Heart full of questions she wouldn't let herself ask. She wasn't looking for closure. She wasn't looking for healing. She just wanted to see it. The place the rumors always circled like vultures. The place people didn't come back from. Or came back wrong. And when the door opened without a sound, Elise didn't hesitate. She stepped inside with her chin high, fists loose, and a look in her eyes that said, I dare you. Thornfield didn't roar. It didn't trap. It observed. Because this was new. This was someone who hadn't been lured. Someone who wasn't afraid to break the rules because she didn't believe in them. Elise stepped into the foyer and frowned. It didn't look haunted, just old, dusty, full of the kind of silence that feels personal. She walked through the rooms as if browsing a gallery, unimpressed. But the house was watching her closely now, adjusting itself, trying to understand this sharp, quiet creature who had stepped into its belly without fear or reverence. It offered her the room of regret. She barely glanced inside before closing the door behind her. It tried the room of the first lie. She laughed bitterly and moved on. And then, somewhere deep within its bones, Thornfield remembered what James and Amara had taught it. This one didn't need to be mirrored. She needed to be heard. The house stopped shifting. The doors stopped presenting themselves. The walls held still, and for the first time in its long, haunted life, Thornfield said nothing at all. It waited. And Elise noticed. She paused in the hallway, one foot already raised to step into another room, and instead, she froze. You're not going to play your game? She asked out loud. No answer. Her voice echoed once, then settled like dust. She turned slowly, suspicion dawning behind her eyes. You're waiting for me to say something. The air trembled, just slightly. That was enough. Elise dropped her pack to the floor and sat against the wall. Not collapsed, just tired. And then, like someone talking to an empty seat on a long bus ride, she began to speak. I was 15 when I stopped believing people meant what they said, she said. 17 when I realized I could lie better than they could. 19 when I left. I've been walking ever since. She looked around. You thought I came here to remember something, but the truth is, I came to see if you'd remember me. A long pause. Then, slowly, a panel in the floor creaked open. No trapdoor, no ladder, just a shallow box beneath the floorboards. Inside it, a single item, a cassette tape. No label, no dust. Elise picked it up. Her fingers shook, not out of fear, but recognition. She had made this, long ago. Her voice on it. Before everything fell apart. She didn't ask how the house had found it. She already knew the answer. It remembered her. She stood, shoulders suddenly heavier. Carried the tape down the hall, into a room the house hadn't named. She sat in the old chair waiting there, and beside it, miraculously, was a tape player. She pressed play, and her own voice came spilling out. Younger, more vulnerable, hurt. I just want someone to say they see me. Just once. That's all. Just once. Elise closed her eyes, and Thornfield didn't twist the walls or rattle the windows. It just held the moment, and in doing so, held her. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. But when she finally stood, there was something different in her spine. A small undoing of armor. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The house didn't need it either. She walked to the front door, paused, and turned. "You're not what they say," she murmured. "Not anymore." And with that, Elise stepped out into the clearing. Behind her, Thornfield exhaled softly, not because it was finished, but because it had been seen again. Without a scream, without a wound, just seen. And far off, beyond the trees, the sky cracked open with sunrise, a golden thread stitching the night to the morning. The house stood still, but inside, in the place where the spiral once turned and the rot once ruled, a voice, young, gentle, whispered, "I'm learning." For the first time in its long, haunted existence, Thornfield chose not to respond. Elise had left hours ago, maybe longer, and yet the house made no attempt to follow her memory, to echo her steps, to hold her scent in the air like it once did with the others. It didn't mimic her voice through vents or show visions of her walking the halls. It simply let her go. There was power in that, in resisting the instinct to cling. Thornfield had been built on desperation. Now, it was learning how not to need. The rooms were quiet, not dead, not empty, just resting. Sunlight crept in through the windows, real this time. Not conjured or manipulated, but soft beams stretching across the floors, touching the corners that had once been shadows with long, golden fingers. Dust drifted lazily in the air, and somewhere near the old drawing room, a floorboard shifted under its own weight, like the house was shifting in its sleep. But beneath the calm, something stirred. A thought. Not loud, not invasive. More like the soft creak of a question forming. Thornfield had held so many people inside it. James, Amara, Elise, and others whose names it never fully caught. Faces in mirrors, voices down stairwells, laughter behind doors. It had watched them, twisted itself around them, tried to understand them. But now, something deeper had settled in the beams and bricks. A want not to contain, but to comprehend. What happens to a house that no longer feeds on pain? What does it become? It began in the library. The books, long warped by mold and the heat of memory, began to dry out. Pages once stuck together peeled themselves free. Spines lifted their heads from the shelves. Titles that had once shifted and blurred, when read now held steady, crisp, and legible. The house had always manipulated knowledge, offering glimpses of forgotten pasts or false futures. But now it offered no riddles, no illusions, only truth. Down the corridor, a door clicked open. By accident or intention, even Thornfield didn't know. It was the room of the breath between doors, once sacred, once hidden, now wide open. Inside, only one thing remained: a table, clean and untouched. And in the center of it, a single sheet of paper, blank, not a trap, an invitation. Because Thornfield didn't want to be the narrator anymore. It wanted to listen. It had watched Elise leave, and had felt something peculiar, not loss, but respect. She hadn't tried to change it, hadn't flinched at its old ways or demanded it be something else. She'd seen the house for what it was, no more, no less. And in doing so, she'd shown it a version of itself it hadn't yet considered. A home. Not for everyone, maybe not for most, but for someone, if it could be still. So it waited in its spiral corridors and its breathing vents and its dusty halls. Waited in its honest rooms and its unopened ones. And outside, the world turned. Slow, oblivious, alive, but change was coming, because word of Thornfield was stirring again. Not in urban legend forums or late-night phone calls between survivors. In dreams. Soft, persistent dreams of a house with too many rooms and no one inside. A house that watched without watching and listened without breathing. People were beginning to remember things they'd never lived. A hallway they'd never walked. A mirror they'd never looked into, but knew exactly what it would show, and Thornfield felt them. It did not reach out. It did not whisper. It hoped. Hoped someone would return. Not to suffer, not to solve, but to sit. To write. To finish the story it had begun long ago, when it was just a wound in wood and brick. A place where someone had cried too long and built walls around their grief. Now it was something else, not safe, not perfect, but possible. And deep in the walls, where once the heartbeat of the house throbbed like a war drum, it now beat steady and low. The beat of patience, of practice, of healing that didn't demand to be seen. No more screams. No more twisted staircases or blood in the wallpaper. Only time and silence and waiting. Miles from Thornfield, in a city that never really got dark, where the glow of signs and the buzz of traffic kept the nights awake. Someone else began to hear it. Not as a voice, not even a whisper, but a weight in their chest when they closed their eyes. Her name was Syrah, and she hadn't slept in 6 days. She wasn't sure why. The doctors called it anxiety. The therapist said trauma. The pills dulled her, sure, but didn't quiet the hum inside her skull that pulsed every time she got close to sleep. Not a noise exactly, more like a rhythm. Familiar, intimate. Like someone else's memory she couldn't get rid of. And each night, it grew louder. Not like it was creeping closer, but like she was sinking into it. By the 7th night, Syrah stopped fighting. She didn't take her meds. Didn't drink to dull it. She simply lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as her fingers twitched with the sensation of something calling her. Not to move, not to run. Just to listen. And when her eyes finally did close, she didn't sleep. She arrived. No journey. No explanation. She stood in front of Thornfield under a navy sky, the moon hanging low, a quiet wind brushing her jacket like a breath she hadn't expected. The house didn't loom. It waited. Still. Observant. Like it had been expecting her. Not as a victim, not as a test, but as a continuation. Syrah stepped forward with a strange sense of knowing. She had never seen this house before, and yet her body moved like it recognized the dirt beneath her shoes. Her feet found the steps without hesitation. Her hand met the doorknob like it had done so 1,000 times before. The door opened for her. Not dramatically, not with menace, just with ease, with welcome. Inside, the air was different than any she'd known, still but not stagnant, alive but not pressing, and warm, not in temperature, but in presence. Like someone holding the air still around you just to let you breathe. Syrah didn't call out. She didn't need to. Whatever Thornfield had been before, she didn't fear it now. She felt its gaze but not its hunger. The house watched her the way one watches a flame, curious, quiet, aware of its power, but not trying to use it. She stepped into the foyer and paused. The floor creaked just slightly beneath her weight, and in response, a door down the hallway slowly opened. The smell of cedar drifted out. Syrah followed, feet silent against the old wood, her body moving through Thornfield, as if the house had wrapped its corridors around her shape and carved them to fit. The room beyond was not twisted, not haunted. It was blank, white walls, wooden floor, a window with no view, and at the center a bed, just a bed, and a note. Syrah crossed the room and picked up the paper resting on the pillow. 6 words, scrawled in familiar handwriting she didn't remember learning, "You may sleep here now safely." She stared at it, not with confusion, but with something deeper, like recognition blooming in the back of her skull. Her hands began to shake, because suddenly she remembered the dreams she'd had as a child, not nightmares. This house, the corridors, the door shapes, the mirror at the end of the hall. She'd been here before. As a child, during the nights when no one checked on her. When the apartment above echoed with yelling. When she'd laid in bed, eyes wide, imagining a house where no one shouted, no one blamed, no one touched without permission. A place made of her own quiet. She had built Thornfield once, in her dreams, and now it had summoned her home. Syrah sat on the bed, tears she didn't know she was carrying slipping down her face. She wasn't afraid. She was exhausted. She laid down, and the house breathed with her. Not loud, not deep, just steady. Sarah fell asleep for the first time in years. And Thornfield, for the first time in its life, became not a house of horrors or haunted reflections, but a refuge. A place that listened, that learned, that waited without demanding. It didn't ask Sarah for anything. It didn't dig through her memories. It simply held her. And when morning came, if such a thing could exist inside a place like Thornfield, Sarah awoke not startled, not lost, just rested. And there, at the foot of the bed, sat a journal, its pages blank, its cover warm, and the same 6 words on the first page: "You may sleep here now, safely." She picked it up and smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in what felt like forever. The house didn't ask her to stay, but she knew she would. Because someone had to write the next story, and Thornfield was ready to be something else. Thornfield no longer needed to stretch itself into a scream. It didn't need to twist halls into traps or lace mirrors with deception. It didn't snatch at the edges of memory like a creature desperate to feed. Now, it did something far stranger. It rested, not in decay, not in silence heavy with dread, but in a hush that felt earned. Like an old man sitting at the edge of a dock, feet swinging over still water, watching the sun rise without needing to explain why. Sarah stayed, not as a prisoner, not as a keeper, as something new. The first guest. She moved through the house like someone learning the steps to a long, forgotten dance. Every room responded differently to her now, no longer shifting to test or provoke. It was as though Thornfield were shy in its softness, like a predator learning not to bare its teeth. The room of what wasn't said no longer throbbed with sorrow when she passed it. Instead, it filled with warmth, as if the words had finally found somewhere else to go. The mirror didn't flash visions. It reflected nothing more than her, bruised beneath the skin, tired in the bones, but real. Every night, she slept, and with each morning came another blank page in the journal that never ran out of space. She wrote what she remembered, what she dreamed, what she wanted to forget. Thornfield read every word, not through some mystical ritual, not through invasive magic, but by presence, by being near. And in that nearness, it began to learn not just what people feared, but what they hoped for, what they longed to say when no one was listening. Then, something strange happened. On the 12th night, Sarah awoke to laughter. Not cruel, not echoing like something clawing up from a basement. Warm, human laughter, the kind that spills when someone tells a joke too stupid to be repeated, but too perfect not to remember. She sat up slowly, heart pounding, not in fear, but in disbelief. She followed the sound down a hallway she hadn't noticed before. It curved softly to the left, past portraits that hadn't been there yesterday, photos of moments she almost remembered, familiar eyes, half-formed smiles. The laughter came from the end of the hall, from behind a door that was open. Sarah stepped inside and froze. There were 4 people seated around a table. They weren't ghosts. They weren't illusions. They looked as alive as she felt. A girl no older than 13, biting her lip as she tried to hide her smile. A middle-aged man with ink-stained hands. A tall woman with streaks of silver in her curls, laughter in her eyes. And a boy, barely 10, who looked up at Sarah and grinned like he'd been waiting for her to arrive. They didn't speak. They simply nodded, not as a welcome, as an acknowledgement. She had found the others. Not everyone who entered Thornfield was trapped. Some, like her, had stayed by choice, to rest, to heal, to rebuild, and the house had begun collecting them, not as offerings, not as tools, but as stories, each one a page in a book that had never been allowed to exist until now. Sarah took a seat. No one asked where she came from. No one asked what she had seen, because in Thornfield now, those things were known, not catalogued, not exposed, simply held. They shared a meal. Bread, fruit, cheese, none of it spoiled, none of it illusion. The house no longer played tricks. It learned how to nourish. After the meal, Sarah wandered back to her room and opened her journal. New words were waiting for her. You are not alone here. The ink was fresh, the handwriting her own, but she hadn't written it. She didn't panic. She smiled. Because it wasn't a warning, it was a truth. The next day, she found another hallway that hadn't existed. At the end of it, a door made of stained glass, glowing faintly from within. When she opened it, music spilled out. A piano, slow and hesitant, like someone relearning how to play a song they'd once known by heart. There was no one inside. Just the piano, and the air thick with welcome. Sarah sat at the keys. She hadn't played in years. Her fingers trembled. But when she touched the first note, the house breathed again. Not with fear, with joy. Thornfield didn't echo anymore. It responded. And somewhere deep in its spine, in the place where the spiral once curled into madness, a small garden began to grow. Not wild, not forced, just green. Alive.
Real?
Because the house had stopped asking what it was, and started becoming something new. Sarah didn't leave. She didn't need to. Because sometimes, the place that once mirrored your pain becomes the place that teaches you how to feel again. And in Thornfield, the story was no longer about survival. It was about living. Thornfield had always lived in the minds of others, dreamers, mourners, the broken and the searching. It shaped itself to their wounds, mirrored their regrets, gave breath and teeth to their silence. But now, with Sarah's laughter still echoing in its quiet rooms and new stories inked gently onto its walls, the house began to wonder, what would it become if it didn't wait to be needed? What if it dreamed not through others, but for itself? It began in the unused wing, the one that once creaked with things better left behind. There, walls had remained untouched for years, doors sealed not by locks, but by memory. Thornfield had always sheed away from this wing, as if it feared what might be buried in rooms it had forgotten how to open. But that night, while the others slept peacefully, no screams, no visions, the floor of the wing stirred with a hum low and strange, a hum not made by a person, a hum made by the house itself. The first door opened, no fanfare, just the soft groan of wood remembering how to move, and inside a room it had never shown anyone. Not James, not Amara, not Elise or Sierra. A room untouched by human grief, its own. Thornfield had carried its pain in silence for so long it had mistaken it for structure. Thought it was just part of the foundation, like beams and bricks and breath. But this room, it was raw, undecorated. The plaster was missing in places, exposing ribs of warped timber. The ceiling dipped unevenly. The corners dripped with black paint or water or memory. It couldn't tell which anymore. And in the center, nailed to the floor, was a wooden chair. No one had ever sat in it. Not yet. Thornfield didn't understand what this room meant, but it knew it mattered. It had kept this pain locked away, even from itself, as if it feared what would happen if it remembered too much. But that time had passed. It wasn't just reacting anymore. It was becoming. And becoming meant remembering, even what hurt. In the room next to it, another door cracked, this one filled slowly with photographs. Not the haunted kind that blinked when no one looked. Real ones. Or as real as Thornfield knew how to make. They developed on their own across the walls. Portraits of the people who had passed through it. James, young and shaking, holding the mirror's edge. Amara, chin tilted high in defiance. Elise, arms crossed, mouth crooked with defiant humor. Sarah, asleep in a sunbeam. They hadn't left marks on the house. They were the marks. And Thornfield felt something stir beneath the floorboards. Not rot, not roots. Something quieter. Emotion. The house didn't know what to call it. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It was a strange, painful softness. The ache that comes not from loss, but from witnessing beauty you don't think you deserve. And so it began to build. Not out of hunger, not out of pain, out of curiosity. New corridors unfolded slowly, like a garden creeping back into soil long denied warmth. A staircase appeared where none had been, spiraling not downward into darkness, but upward into light. No one had ever seen this part of the house, not even in dreams. Thornfield hadn't known it was there until it imagined it into being. At the top of the staircase, a skylight. Real sky beyond it. Not illusion, not memory. Just stars. The house watched them. It had always lived beneath the earth, in the ache of past things. But now it was looking up. That night, Sarah walked the halls and found one of the new rooms. It didn't call her. She just felt it, like how you sense someone watching you in love, not in fear. She entered quietly. The room smelled of lavender and something older, like old pages, warm blankets, and the back of someone's coat you never wanted to forget. At the center was a chair, just like the one in the sealed wing, but this one had no nails, no bindings. It waited to be sat in. She didn't question it. She sat. And the moment she did, the lights in the ceiling flickered. Not ominously, but as if the house had sighed in recognition. A wall in front of her slowly unfolded, like a book opening in reverse, and on it, not a mirror, a window to the house's dream. What Sarah saw brought tears she didn't understand. Gardens, real gardens. Children laughing, but not in haunted echoes, in joy. Rooms filled with music. Fireplaces burning not in warning, but warmth. A wedding. A library without shadows. A hallway where every door opened to something kind. She turned away, overwhelmed, and the window slowly faded. But the feeling didn't. She knew, without a doubt, what the house was trying to say. This is what I want to become. And in that moment, Thornfield, for the first time, felt pride, not for what it had been, but for what it was daring, finally, tremblingly, to imagine. Not a maze, not a cage, a sanctuary. And all it needed now was time, and someone to stay, to believe in that vision with it. To finish the dream. The change wasn't sudden. Thornfield didn't become something new in a flash of light or the breaking of walls. It happened the way all real change does. Quietly, stubbornly, over time. In the stillness between heartbeats. In the choice to open a window instead of boarding it up. In the way it let Sarah leave her journal in the garden without swallowing it whole. The house, after everything, was learning to breathe like a person does, not to survive, but to exist, to grow, to feel. But with that breath came something else, a question it hadn't dared ask in all its years of mirrors and locked doors. Who built me? It came to the house like a memory underwater. Murky, hard to pin down. Not a moment, not a date. A feeling, a warmth followed by a coldness so sharp it cracked the walls from within. And somewhere, deep in the bones of the West Wing, behind a panel that had never been touched, Thornfield found it. The first room. The one it had been built around. Not the oldest room by time, but by intention. This was the seed. The grief that shaped the foundation. The loneliness that demanded walls. The silence so profound it had to become loud just to be heard. The door to the first room didn't creak. It didn't resist. It welcomed Thornfield back like an apology whispered too late, but meant with all the heart that remained. Inside a small study, dustless, untouched, a single chair facing a desk, and on that desk a letter, not written in Sarah's hand, or James, or Amara's. This handwriting was different, older, familiar to Thornfield in a way that made its walls tremble. It read, "I never meant for you to hurt anyone. I only wanted a place to keep the pain where no one else could feel it. But I made you out of that pain, and you became it. I am sorry." Beneath the words, a name. Thorn. The house remembered. Not just the name, the man. The one who built it in grief after losing a son. A man who sealed himself away from the world, brick by brick, memory by memory, until the grief became structure and the structure became sentient. Not because he meant to, but because pain always finds a way to echo if no one listens to it. Thorn had been the first voice. Not the house's, the architect's. And the house had carried that sorrow for so long it forgot it wasn't born. It was made. Thornfield wasn't a name given by ghosts or children or victims. it was thorns. And the field, the empty space he buried his son in. Suddenly, every door made sense. Every loop, every twisted hallway, every locked attic. It wasn't a haunted house, it was his heart, and it had never stopped breaking. The walls groaned, not in fear, not in collapse, in understanding, in mourning, in release. Thornfield finally allowed itself to feel the origin of its being without recoiling. And in doing so, it loosened. A breath held for too many decades finally let go. The house didn't want revenge anymore. It wanted to forgive itself. It started simply. The west wing, long shut, began to open its shutters. The piano room added a second bench. The old cracked tiles in the bathhouse mended themselves, slowly, lovingly. No magic, no spectacle. Just the quiet work of healing. Sarah noticed the change not in thunder or in vision, but in scent. The smell of baking bread drifted through the halls one afternoon. She followed it to the kitchen, which had never worked before. Not once. It had always been cold metal and dry pipes, and a stove that looked like it might eat you instead of cook for you. Now it was warm, lit, and sitting in the center of the table, 2 plates. Bread, butter, and 2 mugs, tea. No specter poured it, no ghost set the table. The house had done it, not because it wanted something, because it wanted to give. Sarah sat. She didn't question it. She broke the bread, took a bite, cried, not because it was sad, because it tasted like childhood. She hadn't remembered until that exact moment. But that was the flavor her mother used to bake when she was very small. Before the shouting, before the silence, Thornfield had found that memory and given it back, not to manipulate, but to return something lost. Sarah looked up at the ceiling, and for the first time, she didn't speak to the house as a mystery, or an enemy, or even a story. She said, "You are real." And the walls around her thrummed, so gently she almost didn't notice. The house wasn't hiding anymore. It wasn't trying to be feared. It was trying, in the only way it knew, to be loved. That night, under stars it no longer had to fake, Thornfield dreamed of Thorn, not as the builder, but as the boy he'd once been. Running through a field with laughter in his lungs, chasing shadows that hadn't yet learned how to haunt. And for the first time the house felt something like peace. Not perfect, not complete, but possible. And in the attic, the final mirror cracked. Not from rage, not from sorrow, from release. Because sometimes, even houses need to remember their name before they can truly be home. The dream lingered long after the house woke. It was still inside Thornfield's walls. Not in the creaking pipes or the warping wood, but in the stillness between the floorboards. In the silence that came not from emptiness, but from something sacred being left undisturbed. A boy running across a sunlit meadow, laughter catching in his throat like wind through wheat, no fear behind him, no grief waiting ahead. That boy was Thorn, before loss. Before blueprints soaked in sorrow, before he built a house out of pain and called it safety. And now, beneath the house that rose from that pain, something shifted. Sarah felt it first, standing barefoot in the hall with the open windows. It wasn't a sound or a tremor. It was something in the bones of the place. Like the house was letting go of weight it didn't need to carry anymore. The air was different that morning. It had lost its heaviness. What once hung thick like breathless dread now felt light, unfamiliar. She pressed her palm against the wall and felt, not pulsing, not resistance, a heartbeat at rest. Thornfield was still changing, not by force, not by fear, but by memory. That afternoon, while walking the west corridor, Sarah noticed something new beneath her feet, a warmth, as though the house had taken sunlight from the windows and soaked it into the wood. She dropped to her knees and touched the floor. It was alive. She could feel it, grass under her fingertips, though the boards had not moved. She closed her eyes. Her breath slowed. Her mind drifted, and suddenly, she was no longer in the corridor. She was standing in a field. Not a memory, not a trick, not a conjured vision. A field. Tall grass, golden light, The scent of clover and something older, earth warmed by sun, time folding in on itself like a secret finally being told. She turned slowly, and there, at the top of the hill, stood the outline of a boy. Thorn. Not the grieving man, not the builder, just the child. He looked at her, curious but unafraid, and he smiled. Then he turned, knelt, and placed something small into the ground. A seed. He covered it with both hands, whispered something she couldn't hear, and stood. The wind rose gently, and the seed bloomed, not into flowers or trees, but a door. Just a single door, wooden and soft, standing in the middle of the field with no frame around it. It didn't lead anywhere. Not yet. Thorn looked back at her one last time, and then he was gone. Sarah opened her eyes. She was back in Thornfield's hall. But something was different. The house had remembered the field it was named for, and it had started growing it back. Beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, under the stone, roots moved. Not malicious, not invasive, but gentle. Like the house had decided to grow instead of rot. And every time Sarah walked from one room to another, she felt the pulse of it. Life threading through the foundation. The others felt it too. Elise returned 2 days later. Not drawn in by fear, but because she missed it. She knocked once, smiled at the door, and stepped inside like she was visiting family. She found Sarah and embraced her without speaking. Amara followed, then James. Each of them returned for different reasons, but all felt the same truth the second they crossed the threshold. Thornfield was no longer a house that fed on pain. It was a keeper of transformation. It had been a mirror. It had been a trap. Now, it was a field in waiting, and with each person who returned, it grew softer, lighter, a hallway filled with drawings of places that had never existed, a room with a piano that played itself to sleep, a window that looked out on stars that hadn't yet been named, and deep beneath it all, the field stretched wider. Sarah began to hear it in her dreams, grass bending as people walked through it, conversations left behind like footprints. It wasn't hers alone anymore. The field was becoming part of the house, and the house part of the people it once trapped. Thornfield wasn't finished, but it wasn't hurting anymore, not in the way it once had. Now, the pain was memory, and the memory was soil. They didn't need to escape it anymore. They stayed, not as victims, not as prisoners, as gardeners, tending the space between past and peace, building a place where others might walk without fear. And the house, Thorn's house, the field that grew from sorrow, continued to learn that it could be more than a monument to pain. It could be a beginning, a place where nothing had to be hidden anymore. Because even the deepest grief, when named and held, becomes something else, becomes a seed. The house was no longer a maze of pain. Thornfield had become something gentler now, but no less powerful, like a storm that had emptied itself and turned into still water, wide and deep. It did not forget what it once was. It didn't ask forgiveness, nor did it seek redemption like some creature hoping to be loved. It simply changed, day by day, floorboard by floorboard. And as it changed, something extraordinary began to happen. People didn't just stay, they began to grow. Not in the way vines creep or moss overtakes a stone. This was different. Sarah was the first to feel it. When she laughed too loud in the sunroom and found that the flowers there bloomed brighter, faster. Elise noticed it when she read her old poetry aloud in the study, and the fireplace lit without a match, flames humming in time with her voice. Amara carved her fears into a door that had no purpose, and it sang, softly, like wind through trees, not mournful but whole. James traced the spiral one final time in chalk, but instead of summoning the old madness, it opened a path into a room none of them had seen before, one with walls, made entirely of old letters no one remembered writing. The house wasn't controlling them. It was responding, as if they were seeds planted into it, and every act of expression, every word spoken in truth, every note sung, every memory faced without flinching, was water to the roots beneath Thornfield. Rooms began to grow not because the house wanted to trap someone, but because it wanted to house them. Not haunt, not test, simply hold. Sarah started calling the rooms by new names. Not the room of lost echoes or the hallway of breathless grief. Now it was the listening room, the laughing room, the room with the blue light. The names weren't clever. They weren't symbolic. They were honest. One night they gathered. Sarah, James, Amara, Elise, and two new faces who had arrived only weeks before Milo, who never spoke but drew stories that made you ache, and Ava, who painted with mud and light and silence. No one had summoned them. Thornfield hadn't reached out. They had found it on their own. Like the house was a note passed under a door in a dream, and instead of shrinking from it, they walked in like they had always known the way. They met in what used to be the dining hall, a place once lined with long, cold tables meant to divide. Now, it was round, a circle of mismatched chairs, candles that didn't flicker with menace, but with welcome. They brought their food. They brought their stories. No one interrupted. No one asked questions too soon. James spoke first. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "how the mirrors used to bite?" There was a laugh around the table, tight at first, but real. Amara nodded. "The one in the upper hall tried to swallow me whole once." "Same," said Elise. "It showed me my father's face. Except it wasn't his face. Just what I thought I remembered." Sarah leaned back, eyes distant. "They don't do that anymore. The mirrors. They don't need to," said Milo softly. It was the first thing he'd said in days. The table fell quiet. It was true. The house no longer needed to reflect pain to understand its guests. It no longer needed to be a container for agony, twisting its rooms to match trauma. It was growing people, and through them, it was being grown. Each moment of honesty made the house deeper. Each act of courage stretched the ceilings higher. When someone cried without shame, the walls hummed. When someone danced down the hallway at night, laughing like they were 5 again, the floorboards caught the rhythm. Something unheard of was happening here. A haunted house was healing by becoming a home, and it was healing those who had once barely survived it. Outside, the trees around Thornfield thickened, not with menace, but with fruit. The brambles that had once barred the gate softened into vines, flowering in every color the house could remember. Deer walked through the courtyard at dusk. Birds began to nest in the eaves. The place was being reclaimed, not by nature, but by peace. But even as this new form took shape, the house did not forget its past. In the oldest part of the cellar, a door remained closed. The spiral chamber, the original wound. Thornfield hadn't reopened it. Not yet. But it hadn't sealed it shut either. It let it be, let it rest, because some griefs, once seen and spoken, do not vanish. They become something else, fertile, and maybe one day, someone would walk down there not to trap themselves, but to plant something. That was the word that kept returning to Sarah. Planting. They were planting themselves into Thornfield, not to bury their pain, but to let it break apart, rot gently, and feed what came next. A garden isn't born from untouched soil. It is born from what has been broken down. They stayed up late that night, talking, singing, writing. Some danced barefoot through the halls. Some cried in rooms that no longer mocked them, and Thornfield held it all, not perfectly, but patiently. Before bed, Sarah walked to the field again, the one that didn't exist on any map, but that now bloomed beneath the floorboards, outside the dreams, between the heartbeats of the house. She knelt, pressed her palm to the earth, and for the first time, something answered back. The soil moved, not with violence, not with warning, but with invitation. Sarah dug a little, just enough to place something down. A seed. She didn't know what kind. She didn't need to. The house would know. And when she stood and looked back at the walls behind her, at the windows glowing warm, she whispered, "Grow gently." And Thornfield did. Not all parts of Thornfield changed at once. Growth came in ripples, not waves. For every room filled with laughter, there remained a hallway that still shivered with old air. And at the far edge of the house, beyond the softened brambles, behind the wing that no one had claimed, there stood a door. No one had built it. No one remembered passing it. It had no knob, no hinges, no seams. Just a slab of wood darker than night, pressed into the wall like a final sentence someone had written, but never spoken aloud. It didn't ask for attention. It didn't open on its own. But its presence was undeniable, the way a missing word lingers on your tongue. Thornfield didn't point to it, didn't whisper about it in vents or shift the floorboards to lead anyone there. But the longer the house lived in this new version of itself, the more that door seemed to hum, quietly, constantly, like a thought the house couldn't forget. Syrah was the first to notice it. She hadn't set out to find anything. She was looking for the room with the broken window that birds kept flying into. But the hallway turned differently that morning, curved when it usually cut straight. She blinked and stood before the door. Her hand twitched. It didn't feel threatening. That's what frightened her most. It felt patient, like it had been waiting, not for someone to open it, but for someone to be ready. She didn't call for James or Amara or Elise. She didn't take notes in her journal or trace symbols on the floor for protection. She simply sat down across from it, cross-legged, silent, and she waited too. The house shifted around her. Hours passed. Daylight moved through cracks in the ceiling. Dust settled and rose again, but the door didn't change. Then, without any sound, it opened. Not inward, not outward. It simply was open, and inside he was nothing. No darkness, no light, no space, just absence, a perfect, terrifying blank. And yet, her name echoed from it, not in a voice, in a memory. Her mother, laughing before everything went cold. Her father, before he vanished into the bottle. The crack of her favorite books, spine opening for the 100th time. The feeling of painting on the walls as a child, when she thought no one was looking. This door wasn't a room, it was her. Everything she had locked up. Every part she'd kept from herself because there was never space for it in a world that asked her to survive instead of feel. Thornfield hadn't made this door, she had. The house had simply waited long enough for her to see it. Syrah stepped inside, and the world didn't fall apart. It filled in, every unfinished sentence, every half-forgiven wound, every joy she'd been too scared to hold on to. The room built itself around her, slowly, gently, a cradle made of memory, a chamber without rules or right angles. Time didn't move there. Or maybe it moved exactly as it needed to. She stayed until she didn't need to anymore. When she stepped back into the hallway, the door was gone, and something in her chest felt settled. She didn't tell the others right away. Not because it was a secret, because she knew they would find their own doors, and they'd open when they were ready. One by one, over the weeks that followed, they did. Elise found hers in a broom closet that had never been there before, lined with photos of all the futures she had once believed were impossible. Amara's stood in the reflection of her own shadow, and she walked through it humming a lullaby her mother used to sing in another language. James found his carved into the side of a tree that hadn't existed yesterday. He opened it and disappeared for 3 days, returning with tear-streaked cheeks and hands stained with paint. Milo and Ava didn't speak about theirs. But something in their silence changed. Like they'd both heard the same note at the end of a song and knew how to carry the tune forward. And Thornfield didn't watch. It witnessed. It didn't steer them. It held them. With every open door, it shed a layer of its old skin. The angry whispers that used to crawl in the walls now faded like echoes too far to reach. The air warmed. The mirrors showed nothing but truth. And the spiral, it stayed silent. Not dead. Just at peace, because the spiral didn't need to trap anymore. It had done its work. Now it was just another part of the house. Not more powerful. Not more sacred. Just another story. And in this house, stories were no longer weapons. They were roots. Sarah planted another seed in the field beneath the house that evening. She didn't know what would grow. She didn't need to. That night, as the others slept, the house dreamed again. Not of death, not of grief, but of children running through a hallway that wasn't afraid of its echoes. Of doors opening because people asked, not because they were dared. Of love written into the beams, laughter soaked into the curtains, and forgiveness folded into every stair that creaked under returning footsteps. And somewhere, deep in the place where its heart used to ache, the house smiled. The spiral had been silent for weeks, and yet no one dared call it gone. Even with the house softening around them, roots replacing rot, doors leading to healing instead of horror, the spiral still lived, buried in the floor of the old cellar, untouched. It was not feared anymore, but neither was it forgotten. Everyone felt it like a tremor under their breath, not a threat, but a memory that might one day wake up. Thornfield had allowed the silence not out of shame, but out of patience. It understood now that wounds do not close because we stop looking at them. They close when they are seen fully, and still loved. James was the one who felt it stir again. He was not dreaming when it happened. He was painting. His canvas was almost blank, just streaks of gray and white meant to capture a fog he remembered from a childhood morning. But then the brush in his hand began to tremble. Not violently, like a finger tracing a scar. He looked down and saw his hand had begun to curl, involuntarily shaping a familiar line, a curve, then another, and another, a spiral blooming in the center of the canvas. Drawn by a hand that didn't feel entirely his anymore, he dropped the brush. It clattered to the floor, but the spiral kept forming, paint flowing on its own now, quiet, sure, not malicious. It didn't pulse or glow. It didn't hiss. It simply appeared. And James, without thinking, whispered, "It's ready." He didn't know how he knew, but Thornfield did. The others gathered in the main hall, each of them sensing something opening beneath their feet. No instructions were given. No warnings were needed. Sarah led the way with a candle in hand. Though they all knew the cellar no longer needed light, Thornfield had lit it from within now. They descended the stairs not as victims returning to a crime scene, but as people who had lived, who had loved and laughed and grieved within this house long enough to see it for what it truly was, not a place of endings, but one of transformation. And down in the deep, they stood at the edge of the spiral together, no longer etched in blood or shadow. It had softened. It no longer clawed at the eye. It drew you in with calmness, with invitation. At the center, something waited. A heart, not a heart made of flesh, not one that beat, but a form, round, glowing faintly, carved from the very first wood that ever framed Thornfield's door. The house's core. Its seed. It pulsed, not with power, but with memory. They approached slowly, reverently, and one by one, they placed something at its base. Sarah laid a page from her journal, one with a poem she had never shown anyone. Elise placed a necklace her mother had given her, the only thing she hadn't thrown away after she left. Amara offered a broken ring, her engagement, her escape. Milo folded a drawing of a door he once dreamed of but never found. Ava left a single strand of her painted hair, wrapped in golden thread. James knelt last. He didn't leave anything physical. He just whispered, "I forgive you." And Thornfield heard. It didn't respond with thunder or change. It simply accepted. Because this moment wasn't about cleansing or fixing. It was about witnessing. The house had been a place of screams, but now it was a listener. It did not erase the past. It held it differently. The spiral at their feet began to rise, not upward, but inward. It folded, quietly, into itself, like a breath being drawn for the first time, like a goodbye that didn't end in silence, but in peace. And then, it was gone. The center of the cellar now held only light, gentle, warm, like morning sunlight through old curtains. The heart of the spiral had not been darkness all along. It had been longing. To be seen, to be understood, to be forgiven. They climbed the stairs together. No rush, no fear. The house didn't creak. It didn't shift. It stood still, as if exiling after holding itself tense for decades. The main hall greeted them with quiet. No whispers. Just the sound of wind brushing against the windows. Sarah returned to the garden beneath the house. The seed she had planted weeks ago had sprouted, not wildly, not unnaturally. Just a single stem, strong, alive. She touched its leaves and whispered, "You're safe now." And for the first time, Thornfield didn't listen from a distance. It listened from within, because they had become part of each other. Not as haunted souls clinging to walls of grief, but as people who had faced the heart of the spiral and survived not despite it, but because of it. The house, finally, had a heart that didn't hurt to carry, and the people who once feared it now called it home. Not because it saved them, but because it let them grow. It came quietly, without thunder, without the breath of something unseen brushing against the back of the neck. No doors slammed, no paintings wept, no lights flickered, as though warning of a presence moving through the walls. It was just a night, still and cold in the way winter always is when it first remembers how to steal warmth from the air. And yet, there was something unmistakably different. Thornfield was tired. Not the dangerous kind of tired, not the exhaustion that precedes collapse, but the deep, full wariness of something ancient that had finally exhaled after carrying weight too long. The house had held grief longer than any human mind could endure. It had twisted itself to accommodate the pain of so many. Now, for the first time, it didn't need to. The grief had been named, the silence broken, and in its place was something resembling peace. Not perfection, but peace. Sarah felt it first. She woke to find her room colder than usual, not from the wind, but from the absence of the usual quiet stirrings that whispered just beneath the edge of sleep. There was no subtle creaking, no soft humming from the hallway. The walls weren't watching her with that polite, waiting stillness they had developed in recent weeks. They were simply still. She sat up and felt it in her chest too. The hush, the almost weightless silence of something larger than herself preparing to rest. She pulled on a sweater and padded into the hallway, expecting to find James pacing or Elise scribbling in her notebook under a stairwell, but the house was empty. Not hollow, not abandoned, just asleep. The lights remained dim but warm. The hearth in the common room flickered gently, but even the flames seemed to burn more slowly, as if the fire itself was yawning. The mirrors reflected no more than what stood in front of them. No flickers of movement, no shadows darting at the edge of vision. The entire house breathed with the slow rhythm of something content. Amara was already in the main hall, curled in one of the velvet chairs, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up as Sarah entered, eyes heavy, but not alarmed. "You feel it?" she asked. Sarah nodded, like it's dreaming, or remembering something it finally doesn't have to protect. Amara said, voice softer than usual. James arrived next, then Elise and Milo. Ava came last, barefoot, silent, her eyes wide not with fear but awe. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. They all understood, in the way people sometimes do when standing beneath stars too vast to describe or watching snow fall on a street that's never known quiet. Thornfield had given so much of itself, bent, twisted, cracked and reopened its heart again and again for each of them. And now, like an old creature finally given space to breathe, it simply needed to rest. They stayed up through the night, not out of vigil, but out of reverence. The house was more than walls and windows now. It was their witness, their co-author, their caretaker. And though it had once mirrored pain, now it reflected something gentler, release. The kind of letting go that doesn't scream or shatter, but just fades softly, like light slipping behind clouds. Milo, with his endless sketch pads, drew the house, not as it looked, but as it felt now. He handed the page to Sarah without a word. On it was Thornfield, nestled into the roots of a massive tree, its windows like shut eyes, its roof blanketed in moss and silence. It looked less like a haunted house and more like a resting place for stories, tucked gently into the earth, breathing slow. As the hours passed, rooms began dimming on their own. Doors closed, not in warning but in kindness, as if to say, "Not now. Let me sleep a while." And for once, none of them resisted. They went to bed without fear of what dreams might wait. They trusted Thornfield the way one trusts a forest to hold its stillness, or a mountain to keep standing when no one is watching. Sarah stayed awake longest. She returned to the garden below, where her little seed had become a sapling. Thin and proud, leaves trembling like they dreamed even while standing. She knelt beside it, brushed the soil, and whispered, "You can sleep too if you want." Behind her, the house hummed, not a call, not a command, but a lullaby. Notes too soft to hold in your hand, but strong enough to still a storm. Thornfield was singing to itself now. Not the song of the lost, but the hush of something ancient curling inward, satisfied. In the days that followed, no one entered new rooms. No one traced new spirals or left offerings at the cellar's heart. They lived gently. They cooked. They read aloud. They sat together and remembered not just what they had escaped, but what they had found. Thornfield, in turn, gave them calm. No surprises, no sudden shifts, just warm tea, sunlight through quiet windows, and the unmistakable feeling that even houses deserve to rest. And then, on the 7th night, something bloomed in the garden. Not a flower, a door, not jagged, not hidden, round-topped, made of polished wood, with a handle of stone. No one opened it. Not yet, because they understood what it meant. The house had slept. And now, soon, it would dream again. But this time, not of grief, of invitation, of becoming, of a story not rooted in pain, but planted in hope. And this time, they would walk through together. When a door blooms, it does not swing open immediately. It waits, quiet, patient, pulsing with a kind of expectation that has no edge to it. The door that rose in Thornfield's garden didn't belong to any known wing of the house, nor did it hum with the usual weight of secrets. It had no rusted hinges or groaning frame. It wasn't trying to trap, test, or torment. It had simply appeared. And what made it more remarkable wasn't how strange it looked, but how peacefully it settled into the soil, as though it had always been there, just waiting to be seen. Sarah was the first to stand before it again. Always the first to touch what the house had grown. But this time, she didn't move closer. She sat in the grass and watched the light shift across its surface. The wood glowed faintly. Not supernatural, just warm, like hands held near a fire. The stone handle had markings worn smooth, almost as if it had passed through many hands before hers. The silence around it wasn't heavy. It was listening. The others joined her in time. James stood behind her, arms crossed but shoulders relaxed. Elise curled beside the sapling, fingers brushing the bark. Amara came last, barefoot, her boots dangling in her hand like she couldn't bear to wear anything that might crush the ground. They didn't speak about what it was. No guesses, no theories, no fear-laced assumptions. They had outgrown the habit of bracing for the worst. Now, they simply waited to see what the house wanted them to see. The door didn't move. Not that day. Not the next. It just stood there, growing. The wood thickened slightly, darkened with morning dew, and softened in the afternoons like it inhaled sunlight. A faint scent clung to the air around it. Not flowers, not rot, something in between. A scent like old stories told by someone you trust. The house didn't groan or whisper. It didn't nudge them toward it. It let them decide. 3 days passed before Ava, the quietest among them, rose before dawn and walked to the door alone. She didn't knock. She didn't even reach for the handle. She pressed her forehead to the wood and stood there, eyes closed, breathing slowly. The house stilled around her. Even the wind hushed. After a long moment, she stepped back. "It's not waiting to be opened," she said that morning. "It's waiting to remember." And just like that, they understood. This wasn't a door to something new. It was a door to something lost. Not a room, not a hallway. A moment. One Thornfield had buried so deep in its bones, it could no longer access it on its own. A final piece. A memory the house had swallowed and never dared to relive. But with them there, with the laughter in the walls, the softness in the mirrors, the forgiveness left on every windowsill, it had enough courage to let it come back. That night, the door opened. No sound, no flash. Just a soft release, like someone unclenching their hand after holding something too tightly for too long. Inside, they found a room that didn't look like the rest of Thornfield. The walls weren't old. The air wasn't thick. It didn't feel twisted or reflective. It felt normal. There was a desk, a bed, a child's shoes beside the door, papers scattered on the floor, drawings, crayon heavy and wild. Sunlight poured in from a tall window, and in the corner sat a chair, and in the chair was him. Not a ghost, not a shadow, but a boy, Thorn's son, the one no one had seen, not in mirrors, not in memories. The reason Thornfield existed in the first place. He looked up at them with eyes wide, not scared, not angry, just waiting. He had been waiting a very long time. Sarah stepped forward. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. She knelt and picked up one of his drawings. A house, not twisted or jagged. Just a simple home with smoke curling from the chimney and a garden out front. He had imagined it better. Even when his father had fallen into grief, even when his spirit had become part of the foundation, he had dreamed of what the house could be. And now, decades later, with pain broken down into story, into seed, into root, it was that. Thornfield had become the house he'd drawn. The boy rose. He walked past them, barefoot on the floorboards that had waited his return, and as he reached the threshold, he turned once, smiled, and stepped out into the garden. His bare feet touched the grass, and he vanished. Not with a scream, not into shadow. He simply dissolved into light, into soil, into peace. The door closed behind him, and this time it didn't fade. It stayed. It belonged now, not as a wound, as a marker. A place where memory was no longer heavy. The next morning, the doorframe had vines growing up its sides. Not to obscure, to celebrate. It was a part of the house now, just like them. And Thornfield rested once more. But this rest wasn't from exhaustion. It was from completion. Every story had been witnessed. Every echo had been heard. And for the first time in its long, aching life, Thornfield was not waiting to become something else. It was home. For the first time in living memory. If you could call what passed through Thornfield's walls living in the traditional sense. The house no longer waited for anyone to define it. It no longer pulled guests into winding corridors or shaped rooms to mirror their darkest truths. The work had been done. The truth had been named. And now, in a silence that didn't carry dread but comfort, the house began the slow, deliberate process of becoming itself. It started with the doors. One by one, the unnamed ones, those thresholds that had always hung like questions, began to carry something new. Not numbers, not warnings. Names. Not given by the people who had passed through them, but chosen by the rooms themselves. As though, after all this time, the house was finally ready to declare its own identity, piece by piece. The first was a library that had never held books before. For years it had stood empty, bare shelves yawning against a floor that never echoed. But now paper bloomed like ivy. Journals appeared, stacked with care, not by ghosts, but by the air itself. The room filled, not chaotically, not hurried, but thoughtfully, as though curating its own memory. Sarah stepped inside one morning and found the words "Room of Unfinished Thoughts" etched into the arch above the door. And when she sat in the chair beside the window, she found a letter in her own handwriting that she didn't remember writing. One she had meant to send to her brother 5 years ago, and never did. Next came the corridor Elise had once avoided, the one where her mother's voice had hissed in her dreams. It changed slowly. The lights softened. The mirror at the end cracked, and beneath it was a portrait. Not of Elise, but of a younger woman smiling in a field, hair in the wind. Her mother, not as the voice Elise feared, but as the woman she once was before the bitterness, before the sharpness. And above the door that led into the room of her childhood memories, the house had written, "The room where forgiveness took root." Elise wept for the first time in weeks, not from grief, from release. James wandered the halls as the house shifted, his fingertips brushing the walls like they might tell him secrets. One room, once sealed so tightly it had resisted every key and spell, opened to him without a sound. Inside he found tools, oils, wood, sketches of furniture he'd never built but had dreamed of building. It was a workshop, complete and waiting. The walls smelled of cedar and lemon. On the bench his first design rested, half built but whole in its intention. He ran his hands across the grain, and the word above the door read the room that waited for your hands. Not every room named itself so clearly. Some were subtle. One opened to a dark sky full of unfamiliar constellations, and Milo spent days beneath it, sketching stars that didn't exist in any map. The door said nothing, but when he left, he whispered, "The room that knows me," and the house hummed in quiet agreement. Amara found her room behind a curtain, not a door. It was small, barely the size of a closet, but the walls were lined with ribbons, each one tied in a knot she instantly recognized. Her grandmother had taught her those knots, the ones used for fishing, for weaving, for mourning. The scent of sea salt filled the air, though there was no ocean near Thornfield. She didn't need one. Her ocean lived in memory. The house had pulled it from her silence and offered it back. She named it herself the room that held the tide. Even Ava, who barely spoke, began to leave small tokens at the doors she passed, a smudge of charcoal, a string of thread, a bead, and slowly, those doors responded, not by opening, but by blooming. One sprouted ivy in the shape of a crescent moon. Another wept rose petals when touched. She never entered them. She didn't need to. She just honored them. And the house understood. What had once been a shifting prison, a cruel maze, had become a map of healing. But not a straight line, not a perfect journey. Each room held its own rhythm, its own breath. Some still held shadows, but they no longer reached out to clutch at ankles or whisper poison in the dark. They sat quietly, like old ghosts with nothing left to say, watching the world grow beyond them. And in the very center of the house, where the great hall had once echoed with footsteps and screaming wood, a tree began to rise. Not overnight, not impossibly fast, just real, steady, strong. Its roots sank into the spiral chamber below, what had once been the place of endless loops, endless hurt, and now those roots drank from everything the house had remembered. The spiral was no longer visible, but its shape lived in the twist of bark, the arch of each branch. Thornfield had taken its oldest wound and turned it into something that could stretch toward the sky. They didn't name the tree. They didn't have to. It was Thornfield. Not the house, not the man, the becoming of both. By the end of the week, the doors had stopped naming themselves, because they didn't need to anymore. They had been seen, heard, chosen. The people who lived inside Thornfield now, because they did live there, truly, not just survive it, began to build a rhythm. Morning walks in the garden, quiet evenings by the hearth, meals shared in laughter. No one tried to fix the house anymore. They tended it like you tend a friend who's healing gently, patiently, without asking it to be more than it was ready to be. And the house, in turn, gave them dreams that didn't echo with screams. It let them rest, because it had found its name. And, finally, it had learned how to speak it without trembling. Thornfield had grown so quietly that they almost didn't notice how different the air had become. It wasn't just the way the halls no longer echoed like they once had. or how the walls held warmth instead of watching. It was something deeper, more rooted. The house no longer reacted to pain. It didn't twist in fear or shift in sorrow. It had begun to listen in a way that was gentle, knowing. And then, as if the house itself had exhaled after a long, held breath, the wind came back. It arrived one morning, just as the first pale light stretched across the east wing. Not a storm, not a warning, just a breeze, soft, slow, and familiar. It slipped through the garden, curled around the base of the great tree, rustled the pages of books left open overnight. It passed through Thornfield like a returning friend, brushing past curtains and stirring the loose curls on Elise's sleeping forehead. The house, once so accustomed to closing itself off, let the wind in without flinching. Sarah was the first to rise and follow it. She moved barefoot down the main hall, her nightgown trailing behind like a shadow at peace. The wind tugged at her hand, not forcefully but insistently, like it remembered her, like it had waited for her. It carried scents that didn't belong to the season. Lavender, rain, damp stone, bread rising in an oven somewhere far away. With every step, memories stirred, not painful ones, but honest ones. A walk with her brother before they stopped speaking. The sound of her mother's laughter before grief took its place. A line of poetry she wrote and tore up, now whispered back to her in the hush of moving air. By the time she reached the tree, the others were already there. Amara stood with her arms crossed, staring into the branches as if they might speak. James leaned against the trunk, eyes closed, mouthing something only the wind could hear. Milo sat on the grass, sketchpad forgotten in his lap, head tilted back, just feeling. And Ava was humming, her voice so low it seemed woven into the leaves. None of them spoke, because all of them understood. The wind had not come to disrupt. It had come to remember. They followed it together. As it wound through the old parts of the house, the wings no one had walked since the earliest days, the rooms that had refused to name themselves even now. The wind didn't force the doors open. It didn't demand to be let in. It reminded the house that it didn't have to be alone anymore, that it could open gently, without fear of what might crawl out. One by one, the locked rooms gave way, not with shrieks or groans, but with a sound like paper turning. Each room was small. Each held something unfinished. In one, a half-written letter, never sent. In another, a child's shoe beneath a chair, left during some forgotten visit. In a third, a wedding dress, still waiting for the ceremony that never happened. The wind didn't mourn these things. It didn't pity them. It lifted them, carried the weight gently, let them go without making them disappear. Thornfield didn't bury them again. It simply let them be. Not erased, not enshrined, just seen. At dusk, the wind returned to the garden. The sky turned violet, heavy with the hush before stars. They gathered by the tree again, and this time the wind spoke. Not in words, not even in sound, but in a feeling so sharp and gentle it made Syrah's breath catch, the feeling of home. Not a house, not a structure, but a truth that didn't need to be earned. You are not what you've survived. You are not the echoes of rooms that once tried to consume you. You are not unfinished. You are becoming, and you are allowed to do it here. The wind circled the tree once, then rose, high into the rafters, into the chimneys, through every window and crack. And as it passed, the house trembled, not in fear, in joy. Thornfield had been built from a man's grief. It had twisted itself around loss, trapped others in its sorrow, mirrored back every jagged emotion with cruel precision. But now it had become a place of choice. The wind had returned not to stir the past, but to free it. That night, Syrah dreamed of open fields, not the ones she had imagined, but the ones Thornfield had remembered from long ago. The original field, the one the house was named after. She stood there, alone, at first. Then the others arrived, one by one, laughing, carrying pieces of the house in their hands. A window frame, a lantern, a wooden stair. And instead of rebuilding the house, They laid them gently in the grass, not to forget, to rest, and from those pieces wildflowers grew, no thorns, just color. When she woke, the first star of morning still hung in the sky. The air was calm. The wind had left, and yet its presence remained, like a promise you've made it, not out, but through. By the time morning rolled in, draping the garden in amber and blue, Thornfield was no longer just a house. It wasn't just walls, windows, and the ghosts of grief. It was something beyond form, beyond structure, an echo made solid, a memory that had chosen not to haunt, but to release. No one said it aloud, but they all felt that the end had arrived. Not a sharp, jarring end, not like doors slamming or breath cut short, but something quieter, like a candle burning down, not blown out. Like the final page of a book you thought would destroy you, and instead left you healed. The tree in the center of the garden had grown taller overnight. No one had seen it stretch. No branches had cracked. No roots burst through the ground. It had simply become. Its leaves were thicker, shifting between deep greens and golden hues, humming with quiet energy like they were collecting the last pieces of pain and turning them into something useful. The spiral was gone. Not hidden. Gone. Absorbed into the roots, or maybe into them. The ones who'd stayed, faced the darkest hallways, made peace with mirrors that once showed only their worst selves. Syrah stood by the trunk, her fingers brushing the bark. It no longer felt like Thornfield's heart. It felt like its memory. And that, she realized, was the most important difference. The house had moved past being the vessel of pain. It had told its story. It had been heard. It could rest now. The rooms had stopped shifting days ago. Even the more unpredictable wings had grown quiet, choosing their shape and holding it. The room of unfinished thoughts remained a library, though the books within now changed slowly, like breathing. The room that held the tide stayed briny and sweet, the sea sound a lullaby now. The halls no longer twisted. The shadows no longer lingered. And the doors that once led nowhere now opened only to light. James packed his few belongings. Not because he needed to leave in a rush. There was no danger now. But because the house no longer needed to be kept company. He looked out the window of his old room and saw not a haunted expanse, but a home that had run its course. His hand ran over the desk, the windowsill, the cracked bit of wall where he'd once left a desperate tally of days. That desperation was gone now. In its place was a simple kind of love. Respect. "I think I'm done," he said softly. Elise sat beside the tree, journal open in her lap. "Me too." "Not because we're running," Sarah added, joining them, "but because we can go." That was the difference, wasn't it? In the beginning, Thornfield had trapped them all in place. It had kept them crawling through past horrors, forcing them to bleed in order to breathe. But now it opened the door. Not with a show, with permission. They gathered in the main hall, all 7 of them, as light spilled through the ceiling windows. No one rushed. No one cried. There were smiles, tired, honest ones. The kind you give after finishing something that nearly broke you. Amara took off her boots and left them beside the hearth. "Let the house keep them," she said. "I think they belong here more than I do now." Milo placed his final sketch on the mantel, a drawing of the house as it stood now, with the tree at the center and each of them scattered through the windows, smiling, eyes open, awake. Ava tucked a single painted bead into the corner of a stair, then kissed the banister. No words. Just love. They walked through the front door together. And this time, the house let them. No screams. No walls closing in. Just the soft creak of hinges, the touch of warm air, and the wind that had returned for one final goodbye. They stood on the front lawn, the garden behind them. The tree rising like a cathedral of everything they'd overcome. Thornfield didn't vanish. It didn't sink into the ground or crumble into ashes. It remained, but lighter, smaller somehow in its presence, like something that had finally forgiven itself. Sarah turned last. She whispered, "Thank you." The door closed behind her and didn't open again. Not out of anger, out of completion. They walked together down the dirt path, toward a horizon none of them had expected to see. There were no plans, no promises, only the knowing that what waited beyond wasn't more horror, but more life. A life they were free to shape without the house telling them who they were. And back in the quiet of the now, still rooms, Thornfield slept. Not the sleep of pain, nor the restless kind that waits for someone to stir it into violence, but the sleep of something that knows it did what it was meant to do. It held them. It hurt them. It taught them. And then it let them go. And in doing so, it set itself free,